Sir, we need $85,000 by tomorrow morning or we can't perform the surgery. David Morrison stared at the number on the hospital estimate, $85,000. His 16-year-old daughter Emma lay unconscious in the cardiac unit, her heart failing, while he stood helpless with empty pockets and maximum credit cards. 48 hours to save her life. $0 to do it. 30 miles away, Alexandra Sterling pressed her face against floor-to-ceiling windows, clutching a photo of her dead husband and son. The $500 million inheritance from their plane crash sat untouched in bank accounts. Blood money she couldn't spend, while real people died from problems she could solve with pocket change. Please, I'll pay anything work overtime for 10 years. She's just 16. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. Loan denied. Bank after bank. Friend after friend. Every door slammed shut while Emma's heart monitor beeped its countdown to disaster. What these two broken souls didn't know was that in exactly 72 hours, a violent storm would bring them together in the most impossible way. A carpenter with nothing would meet a billionaire with everything. A father desperate to save his daughter would encounter a grieving mother desperate to matter again. One moment of human kindness during a crisis would spark the most complicated love story you've ever witnessed. Because when David Morrison pulls over to help a struggling nurse, stranded in the storm, he has no idea she's actually Alexandra Sterling, the woman whose company could solve every problem in his life with a single phone call. But she's hiding more than just her identity. She's been secretly paying his bills, manipulating his life, playing guardian angel while living the most elaborate lie ever told. Watch what happens when a billionaire falls in love with a poor family and discovers that money can't buy the one thing she needs most, the courage to be honest about who she really is. Because this isn't just a love story, it's about the price of deception, the cost of pride, and what happens when two people who need each other most are separated by the one lie that could destroy them forever. Will love survive when the truth comes out? You won't believe what happens next. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. David Morrison's feet hit the cold hardwood floor of his modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street muscle memory, guiding him through the familiar routine. Coffee first, black strong, and made from whatever was on sale at the grocery store. Then a quick check on Emma, still sleeping peacefully in the room that had once belonged to both his children before cancer took their mother and childhood innocence took everything else. By 5:15, David was already at Morrison Carpentry, the small shop he'd inherited from his father 20 years ago. The weathered sign outside still bore the original phone number, hand-painted in fading blue letters, that he touched up every spring like a ritual. Inside the concrete floor was swept clean tools, organized with the precision of his military days. This wasn't just his livelihood, it was his legacy, his identity. The one thing that connected him to the man he'd been before. Grief rewrote his entire story. The morning light filtered through dusty windows as David reviewed the day's work orders. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen cabinets needed refinishing, a job he'd quoted at cost because the 82-year-old widow lived on Social Security and made him cookies every Christmas. The Henderson's deck repair would actually turn a profit, thank God, enough to cover Emma's heart medication for another month. And if he was lucky, the evening shift at Home Depot would yield some overtime hours. 3 jobs, 7 days a week. It still wasn't enough. David's hands moved efficiently across the wood, decades of experience guiding each cut, each joint, each careful measurement. Carpentry had been his therapy after returning from Afghanistan, the rhythm of creation, helping heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. When Sarah was diagnosed, when the medical bills started piling up like snow in a Colorado winter, when hope became a luxury they couldn't afford through it all, Wood didn't lie. Wood didn't promise miracle cures it couldn't deliver. Wood simply asked for skill, patience, and honest work. The bell above his shop door chimed at precisely 10:30 a.m. Tony shuffled in his Vietnam veteran's cap, askew, his weathered face bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who slept in doorways. David didn't look up from his work, just reached into his lunch cooler and handed over the extra sandwich he'd packed. It was their Friday ritual, no words needed, no thanks expected. Tony would nod, David would continue working, and for a moment 2 soldiers would understand each other perfectly. Emma's got another appointment next week, David mentioned casually, the way other men might discuss the weather. Tony knew about the heart condition, about the mounting medical debt, about the insurance company's latest denial letter that David had crumpled, and thrown away by rather than let his daughter see his despair. "That girl's tough as her old man," Tony replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen young people face impossible odds. "She's going to be fine." David nodded, though they both knew fine was a relative term when your daughter's heart was failing and the treatment that could save her life cost more than most people's houses. The afternoon brought Emma herself backpack slung over her shoulder, honor roll certificate folded carefully in her notebook. At 16, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned early that her body could betray her without warning. But her eyes, Sarah's eyes, still held dreams that medical bills couldn't diminish. "Dad, I got the scholarship application for Colorado State's pre-med program," she announced, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. They both knew college was a beautiful impossibility, a conversation they danced around like partners avoiding a bruise. "That's great, sweetheart," David said, setting down his hammer to give her his full attention. Emma deserved that much even when hope felt like cruelty. "Dr. Martinez says my latest echo looks stable. Maybe good enough for college applications." The careful optimism in her voice broke something inside David's chest. Emma had inherited more than her mother's eyes. She'd inherited Sarah's fierce determination to find light in the darkest corners. She studied medical journals the way other teenagers scrolled social media, determined to understand the enemy that lived inside her chest. Evenings found David in the kitchen, teaching himself to cook meals that wouldn't spike Emma's blood pressure while staying within their grocery budget of $60 a week. Chicken and rice again. Frozen vegetables from the discount store. Emma never complained, just helped with homework, spread across the kitchen table, both of them pretending the stack of medical bills beneath the fruit bowl didn't exist. Mrs. Rodriguez called, Emma mentioned casually, not looking up from her chemistry textbook. "She wants to know if you can fix her grandson's bedroom. The ceiling's leaking." David calculated quickly the Rodriguez family was struggling even more than they were recent immigrants working multiple minimum wage jobs. The roof repair would take a full weekend, materials would cost $200, and they probably couldn't pay more than $50. "Tell her I'll stop by Sunday to take a look," he said. Emma glanced up, understanding passing between them. Her father would do the work for free, call it a payment plan, and somehow find a way to cover the materials. It's what Sarah would have done. It's what good people did even when they couldn't afford goodness. The house settled into evening quiet, Emma finishing homework while David reviewed invoices by lamplight. On good nights, the numbers almost balanced. On bad nights, he found himself staring at Sarah's photo on the mantel, asking impossible questions. How do you raise a daughter alone? How do you find hope when the future costs more than you'll ever earn? How do you explain to a 16-year-old that her dreams might die, not from lack of talent, but from lack of money? The bedroom down the hall remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Her nursing textbooks still stacked on the nightstand, her uniform hanging in the closet like a promise she couldn't keep. David slept on the living room couch, telling himself it was to be closer if Emma needed help during the night. Really, it was because the emptiness of that bed felt like drowning. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, David allowed himself to remember the man he'd been before the soldier, the husband, the father who believed hard work and good intentions were enough to protect the people you loved. That man felt like a stranger, now buried under 3 years of bills and sleepless nights in the terrible arithmetic of poverty. But he was still Emma's father, still the keeper of Sarah's memory, still the man who got up at 4:30 every morning and built things with his hands because someone had to. Someone had to believe that tomorrow might be different, even when today offered no evidence of hope. The last thing David did each night was check the locks, count the cash in the emergency jar, and promise Sarah's photo that he wouldn't give up. Not yet. Not while Emma still believed in medical school and miracle cures and fathers who could fix anything broken, even when he wasn't sure he believed in those things anymore himself. Alexandra Sterling woke each morning in a bed that cost more than most people's cars in a penthouse that towered above Denver like a monument to everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. The smart home system whispered the day's agenda in a voice designed to be soothing: board meetings, charity luncheons, investment reviews. All of it felt like performance art. Alexandra playing the role of a successful businesswoman, while the real woman, the one who had died with her family 18 months ago, watched from somewhere outside her own body. The marble bathroom mirror reflected a face that Grace magazines had called edgeless and inspiring. The sort of hollow compliments paid to wealthy widows who maintained appearances. Alex saw something different in that reflection, a ghost wearing designer makeup, a woman whose heart had been buried in Colorado soil alongside her husband and son. Marcus had been her anchor, the boy she'd met in college, who loved her long before Sterling Properties became an empire. Tyler had been their miracle, the child doctor said they'd never have, whose laughter could fill rooms twice the size of their penthouse. The private jet was supposed to take them to Tyler's baseball tournament in Phoenix. Alex had stayed behind for a last-minute board meeting, promising to catch the next flight. She'd been reviewing quarterly reports when the call came. Clear skies, perfect flying conditions, mechanical failure that investigators still couldn't fully explain. 3 words that ended one life and began another. No survivors found. The settlement money, as if any amount could settle the rage and emptiness, had been donated to children's charities. The business continued running itself, a machine built so well it barely needed her involvement. Alex found herself with unlimited resources and absolutely nothing she wanted to buy. That's when Dr. Williams, her grief therapist, had suggested volunteer work. "You need to feel useful again," she'd said with the kind of gentle authority that came from watching too many wealthy patients discover that money couldn't medicate meaninglessness. So Alexandra Sterling, CEO and heiress, had become Alex Miller's social worker. It started as 1 day a week at Aurora Community Center, but slowly expanded as she discovered something precious in the worn linoleum halls and secondhand furniture. People who needed help, she could actually provide problems with solutions more complex than writing checks. The Aurora Community Center occupied a converted elementary school, its hallways still painted in primary colors that had faded to pastels. Alex's office was a former classroom where she helped struggling families navigate social services, insurance claims, and the bureaucratic maze that separated people from the help they desperately needed. Her Harvard MBA had prepared her for hostile takeovers, not teaching single mothers how to apply for heating assistance, but somehow the skills translated. "Mrs. Chen, the Medicaid application was denied because you missed one signature," Alex explained patiently, highlighting the correction needed on page 7 of the 15-page form. Around them, the center buzzed with controlled chaos. Children in the after-school program, seniors playing cards, teenagers learning job interview skills in the computer lab. This work required a different kind of intelligence than board meetings. Here, success was measured in small victories, a family avoiding eviction, a child getting needed medical care, an elderly person finding companionship instead of isolation. Alex discovered she was good at it not because of her wealth, but because grief had taught her to listen differently. Her apartment in Aurora, a modest 2-bedroom she'd rented under the Miller identity, felt more like home than the penthouse ever had. Simple furniture from discount stores, plants. She actually remembered to water neighbors who borrowed sugar and invited her to block parties. The Honda Civic in her parking spot had 80,000 miles and a check engine light that came and went like a moody relative. She'd kept one piece of her old life, the photograph of Marcus and Tyler, that sat on her bedside table, the only witnesses to the tears she cried each night before sleep. They were why she continued the charade, why she lived this double life between Sterling Properties board meetings and Aurora Community Center budget constraints. In their memories, she was trying to become someone worthy of the life they'd lost. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 20 years accumulating wealth, and now the only moments that felt authentic were those spent helping people who had none. Her therapist called it survivor's guilt manifesting as service. But Alex knew it was simpler than that. When you lose everything that matters, you learn to recognize what has meaning and what's just expensive decoration. Friday evenings, Alex would drive back to the penthouse, trading her social worker clothes for designer suits, like Clark Kent in reverse. The elevator ride to the 30th floor felt like ascending to another planet, one where her housekeeper had prepared dinner, for one, where silence was broken only by the sound of her own footsteps on imported marble. Sometimes she'd stand at those floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city where real people lived, real lives in real homes, and wonder if Marcus and Tyler would recognize the woman she'd become. Would they be proud of her volunteer work or heartbroken that she was hiding from the world they'd loved together? The money would always be there, invested, managed, multiplying, whether she paid attention or not. But the work at Aurora, the feeling of being needed for something other than her bank account that felt like resurrection. Like maybe there was a version of Alexandra Sterling worth salvaging from the wreckage of her old life. She just wasn't ready to let anyone see her yet. Not the real her with all her damage and desperate need to matter again. Alex Miller was safer, smaller, more manageable. Alex Miller could fail without disappointing. Investors could cry without causing stock prices to fluctuate, could love again without risking every mohing. Alex Miller was the woman she might have been if she'd never lost her family, never inherited an empire, never learned that money was the loneliest currency in the world. She just hadn't expected Alex Miller to feel more real than the woman whose name was carved into marble lobbies across Colorado. Aurora, Colorado stretched between Denver's glittering downtown and the foothills of the Rocky Mountains like a bridge between worlds. Once a sleepy farming community, it had evolved into a working-class suburb where immigrant families chased American dreams alongside multi-generational Coloradans whose ancestors had settled the land before it had streetlights. The main drag Colfax Avenue told Aurora's story in storefront windows, family-owned taquerias, next to chain restaurants, independent hardware stores fighting to survive alongside big box retailers, beauty salons, where 3 generations of women got their hair done side by side. It was a place where people still knew their neighbors' names, where community meant something more than shared zip codes. Roosevelt High School anchored the neighborhood's hopes of sprawling brick building, where Emma Morrison earned straight A's while dreaming of medical school, where teachers like Mr. Rodriguez worked second jobs to make ends meet, where the college counselor kept scholarship applications in manila folders organized by impossibility rather than deadline. The building showed its age in cracked sidewalks and outdated textbooks, but it still graduated kids who became doctors, teachers, and business owners, proof that dreams could flourish even in underfunded soil. The Aurora Community Center occupied the neighborhood's heart, a converted elementary school where former classrooms had been transformed into spaces for hope. The cafeteria served free meals to anyone who needed them, no questions asked. The gymnasium hosted everything from quinceañera celebrations to town halls about city budget cuts. The computer lab offered free internet access and job application assistance, staffed by volunteers who understood that dignity was just as important as charity. St. Mary's Hospital sat on the neighborhood's eastern edge, a mid-sized facility that served both Aurora's families and overflow patients from Denver's overcrowded emergency rooms. The cardiac unit where Emma Morrison had spent too many nights was staffed by nurses who remembered patients' names and doctors who still believed in bedside manner, even when insurance companies and administrative costs made compassion feel like a luxury they couldn't afford. This was where class differences became geography. Downtown Denver's gleaming towers visible on clear days, reminding Aurora's residents of a world just close enough to see, but far enough to feel unreachable. It was where a billionaire could volunteer at a community center without anyone questioning why a social worker drove a newer car than some of the families she served. It was where a carpenter's daughter could dream of medical school while knowing the distance between dreaming and doing was measured in dollars most people would never see. It was the perfect place for 2 broken people to find each other in a neighborhood that specialized in second chances and believed that hope was a renewable resource even when everything else was running out. The storm hit Aurora like a boxer's surprise punch, sudden, devastating, and completely without mercy. What had started as routine afternoon clouds over the Rocky Mountains transformed into a deluge that turned streets into rivers and exposed every weakness in Colorado's aging infrastructure. The Weather Service would later call it a 100-year flood, the kind of disaster that reminds suburban communities they're still at nature's mercy despite all their concrete and careful planning. David Morrison gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Ford pickup as sheets of rain hammered the windshield faster than the ancient wipers could clear them. Emma sat beside him in the passenger seat, her face pale, not from the storm, but from the afternoon they'd just endured at Children's Hospital. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in the cab like thunder. The arrhythmia is getting worse. We need to consider more aggressive treatment options. More aggressive meant more expensive. More expensive meant impossible. Dad, the water's getting deeper, Emma observed with the careful calm she'd learned from years of medical crises. The intersection of Alameda and Peoria had become a lake murky water, reflecting stoplights like distorted Christmas ornaments. Other cars had turned back, but David's truck was their only transportation, and home was just 6 more blocks through this biblical nightmare. That's when the engine cough sputtered and died with the finality of a judge's gavel. No, no, no. David muttered, turning the key again and again as the truck settled deeper into water that now reached the door handles. The starter cranked weakly, then nothing. Around them, the storm seemed to intensify as if nature had been waiting for this moment of maximum vulnerability. Emma's breathing changed the shallow, rapid pattern that preceded her episodes. The stress, the confined space, the rising water, all combining to trigger the very condition they'd spent the afternoon discussing with specialists they couldn't afford. "Dad, I can't. My chest feels tight," she managed between labored breaths. David's own breathing stopped entirely. This was how it happened, not in hospitals with teams of doctors, but in moments like this when help was miles away and time was measured in heartbeats. His PTSD, dormant for months, roared to life with the familiar cocktail of helplessness and rising panic. Another person he loved, another situation beyond his control, another reminder that good intentions meant nothing when physics and poverty collided. That's when the headlights appeared through the curtain of rain, followed by the sound of a car door slamming. Through the passenger window, a figure in a rain jacket waded through knee-deep water with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to emergencies. "I'm a trained first responder," the woman called through the glass, her voice somehow cutting through wind and rain and David's own thundering heartbeat. "Let me help." Alex Miller had been driving home from her volunteer shift when she'd seen the truck stalled in the intersection. Her first instinct had been to drive around. She wasn't Alex Sterling tonight with resources to throw at problems. She was just Alex Miller, social worker, heading home to a modest apartment and a frozen dinner for one. But then she'd seen the teenager in the passenger seat, the familiar signs of respiratory distress, the father's face twisted with the particular terror of watching your child suffer while being powerless to help. In that moment, in every grief counseling session, every volunteer training, every night she'd lain awake wondering if her life still had purpose crystallized into clarity. This was why she was still here. This was why she'd survived when Marcus and Tyler hadn't. "My daughter has a heart condition," David called back his military training, warring with paternal panic. "She's having trouble breathing." Alex was already pulling out her phone, dialing 911 with practiced efficiency while moving closer to assess the situation. The emergency dispatcher's voice was crisp and professional. "Aurora 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Alex Miller, volunteer coordinator at Aurora Community Center. I need an ambulance at Alameda and Peoria. 16-year-old female with known cardiac condition experiencing respiratory distress, trapped in vehicle in floodwater." As she spoke, Alex noticed David's hands shaking on the steering wheel, the thousand-yard stare she'd learned to recognize in other veterans. The daughter needed medical attention, but the father was experiencing his own crisis trauma layered on trauma until the present moment became unbearable. "Sir, I need you to look at me," Alex called through the driver's window, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd talked people through their worst moments. "Your daughter needs you calm right now. Can you unlock the doors?" The next 10 minutes passed like a carefully choreographed dance between strangers. Alex talking Emma through breathing exercises while keeping David focused on practical tasks: unlock doors, gather insurance cards, prepare for evacuation. When the fire department arrived, Alex had already created a chain of stability that turned panic into manageable crisis. "I want to ride with her," David said, as paramedics loaded Emma onto a stretcher, his voice carrying all the desperation of 3 years' worth of medical emergencies. "Follow in my car," Alex suggested, car keys already in her hand. "The roads are still dangerous and you shouldn't be driving alone right now." It wasn't until they were sitting in Aurora General's waiting room, both soaked through and exhausted, that David really looked at the woman who'd appeared out of the storm like some kind of guardian angel. Alex Miller, or so her volunteer ID badge read, was probably in her late 40s with prematurely gray hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. Her clothes were simple, functional, the kind worn by people who valued comfort over fashion. But there was something about her bearing, the way she'd taken charge during the crisis, that suggested depths David couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate for what had just transpired. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." "I have some experience with medical emergencies," Alex replied carefully, not mentioning the years she'd spent learning emergency response as part of her volunteer training or the grief counseling that had taught her to recognize trauma in others. "Your daughter seems remarkably mature for 16. She's had to be." David's voice carried the weight of every parent who'd watched their child grow up too fast. Lost her mother 3 years ago. Cancer. Since then, it's just been us figuring things out together. Something flickered across Alex's face, recognition perhaps, or shared understanding of loss. I'm sorry, that must have been incredibly difficult. Emma's stronger than I am. David admitted, the honesty surprising him. He wasn't usually forthcoming with strangers, but crisis had a way of stripping away normal social barriers. She wants to be a doctor, pediatric cardiology specifically, says she wants to help kids like herself. That's remarkable, Alex said, and meant it. In her volunteer work, she'd met plenty of teenagers whose dreams had been shaped by necessity rather than possibility, but few with Emma's focused determination. She must get her strength from somewhere. David glanced toward the treatment area where Emma was undergoing tests. Her mother was a nurse. Sarah always said the best medical professionals were the ones who understood what it felt like to be patients. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers who'd shared an extraordinary experience. Alex found herself studying David's profile, the worry lines around his eyes, the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools, the careful way he held himself like a man carrying too much weight. There was something familiar about his particular brand of exhaustion, the look of someone who'd learned that vigilance was the price of love. Mr. Morrison. A nurse appeared in scrubs, decorated with cartoon hearts. Emma's stable. Dr. Patel would like to speak with you about adjusting her medication. David stood quickly, relief evident in every line of his body. Thank you again, he said to Alex. I mean it. You probably saved her life tonight. I'm just glad I was there, Alex replied, pulling a business card from her purse. I work at Aurora Community Center. We help families navigate situations like this. Insurance issues, medical advocacy, things like that. If you ever need assistance. David took the card, studying the simple print, Alex Miller, Family Services Coordinator. Below it, a phone number and the center's address. I'll remember that, he said, meaning it. As he disappeared through the double doors to be with his daughter, Alex remained in the waiting room for a long moment, staring at her hands. They were shaking, slightly delayed reaction to the adrenaline, or maybe something deeper. For the first time in 18 months, she'd acted purely on instinct, without calculation or second-guessing. She'd been exactly where someone needed her to be, exactly when they needed her there. It felt like resurrection. 3 days later, Emma Morrison walked into Aurora Community Center with the determined stride of someone on a mission. The building's cheerful chaos, children playing in the after-school program, seniors chatting over coffee, the constant hum of people helping people, should have been overwhelming for someone still recovering from a cardiac episode. Instead, Emma seemed energized by it. I'm looking for Alex Miller, she announced to the receptionist, a grandmother with kind eyes and infinite patience for walk-ins. She helped my dad and me during the storm. Alex emerged from her office carrying a stack of Medicaid applications, wearing the same practical clothes Emma remembered, but somehow looking different in her natural environment. Here, surrounded by families who needed guidance through bureaucratic mazes, Alex moved with quiet authority and genuine warmth. Emma, how are you feeling? Alex's concern was immediate and authentic, the kind of attention Emma had learned to distinguish from mere politeness. Much better, thanks to you. Emma replied, then launched into the speech she'd been practicing. I wanted to thank you properly, and also, well, my dad's too proud to ask for help, but we could really use some guidance with insurance stuff. The hospital bills are going to be... She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by the admission of financial struggle. At 16, Emma had already learned that poverty carried its own particular shame, the constant awareness that your problems were both desperately important to you and completely ordinary to everyone else. Would you like to sit down? Alex suggested, gently leading Emma to a small conference room where families met to discuss everything from housing assistance to college applications. Tell me what's going on. For the next hour, Emma laid out their situation with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to see her own life as a series of medical and financial problems requiring solutions. Heart condition diagnosed at 12, mother's death and subsequent medical debt, father working 3 jobs but still falling behind on specialized care costs, insurance company's latest denial for the surgery Dr. Martinez recommended. Alex listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just witnessing the careful way Emma had organized their crisis into manageable categories. It was heartbreaking and impressive in equal measure, a child forced to become her family's advocate while still dreaming of medical school. Your father sounds like a remarkable man, Alex said finally. He is, Emma replied with fierce loyalty. He's never missed one of my appointments, never made me feel like a burden, never stopped believing I could have a normal life. But I can see what this is doing to him. The worry, the financial stress. Sometimes I catch him just staring at bills, and he looks so defeated, Alex suggested softly. Yeah, and that's not who he is. He's the strongest person I know. Alex felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond professional sympathy. She understood the weight of medical bills, the way insurance companies could turn healing into a luxury good. More than that, she understood what it meant to watch someone you love carry burdens they shouldn't have to bear alone. I'd like to help, Alex said carefully. We have programs here for medical advocacy, help with insurance appeals connections to specialists who work with uninsured families. Would your father be open to meeting with me? Emma's face lit up with hope, then clouded with teenage realism. He's really proud. He doesn't like accepting charity. This wouldn't be charity, Alex assured her. It would be navigation assistance. Think of me as a translator between your family and the healthcare system. Someone who knows which forms to fill out, which programs you might qualify for, how to appeal insurance decisions effectively. You'd really do that. Emma, 3 days ago, you and your father were strangers to me. But helping families like yours, that's not just my job. It's why I do this work. Sometimes we all need someone in our corner who knows the system. Emma studied Alex's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read adults carefully, looking for the difference between genuine offers and polite deflections. Okay, she said finally, but can we meet here at the center? Dad's more comfortable on neutral ground. Of course, Alex replied, already mentally rearranging her schedule. How about Saturday morning? We could do a comprehensive review of your insurance situation, see what options we haven't explored yet. As Emma left with a confirmed appointment in something that looked suspiciously like hope, Alex remained in the conference room, staring at her notes. David Morrison, carpenter. Emma Morrison, aspiring physician. Both struggling with problems that money could solve in minutes, if only she could find a way to help without revealing who she really was. For the first time since the accident, Alexandra Sterling was faced with a problem that wouldn't be solved by writing a check. This would require something much more complicated, much more dangerous. This would require Alex Miller to become real. Saturday morning sunlight streamed through the community center's windows as David Morrison sat across from Alex Miller at a small conference table covered with insurance documents, medical bills, and what appeared to be a miracle worker's understanding of healthcare bureaucracy. It had been 2 weeks since their first meeting, and this was their 4th session together, a routine that had somehow become the brightest part of David's week. The key is understanding that insurance companies count on people giving up, Alex explained, highlighting sections of Emma's policy with practiced efficiency. This denial letter, its template language designed to discourage appeals. But look here, she pointed to a paragraph buried in fine print. They're required to cover experimental treatments when standard protocols have failed and the attending physician deems it medically necessary. David studied the document, amazed by Alex's ability to find hope buried in legal language that looked like deliberate obfuscation. How do you know all this? Years of helping families fight these battles, Alex replied, which was technically true. She'd spent countless hours learning healthcare advocacy as Alexandra Sterling, attending board meetings where insurance policies were dissected like complex financial instruments. The irony that she now used that knowledge to fight the very system she'd once helped create wasn't lost on her. Their meetings had evolved beyond simple paperwork sessions. Emma attended most of them, drawn by Alex's genuine interest in her academic goals and medical ambitions. While David and Alex worked through insurance appeals, Emma would spread homework across the table, occasionally asking Alex questions about college applications or career planning that revealed an intelligence far beyond her 16 years. Miss Miller, Emma said during one session, looking up from her chemistry textbook, you really think I could get into pre-med programs? I mean, realistically. Alex set down her pen and gave Emma her full attention. I think any medical school would be lucky to have someone who understands both the science and the human experience of illness. Your perspective as a patient could make you an extraordinary physician. But the costs, Emma's voice trailed off, encompassing not just medical school tuition, but the surgery she needed, the ongoing treatments, The reality that poverty could kill dreams as effectively as any disease. One step at a time, Alex said gently. Let's get your health stabilized first, then worry about college funding. There are ways to make it work if you're determined enough. David watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. In 3 weeks, Alex had become more than an advocate. She'd become Emma's champion, someone who saw his daughter's potential instead of just her limitations. When was the last time an adult outside their family had invested this much time in Emma's future? I should pay you for these sessions, David said after Emma returned to her homework. You're spending hours on our case. David, I work for a community center funded by donations and grants. Helping families navigate systems is literally what we do here. Alex's response was smooth, well-practiced, and completely true while concealing everything that mattered. Besides, Emma reminds me why I got into this work in the first place. Their conversations had begun extending beyond insurance forms and medical appeals. David found himself sharing stories about his carpentry work, the satisfaction of building something lasting with his hands. Alex spoke about her volunteer experiences with other families, always careful to maintain professional boundaries while revealing glimpses of someone who understood struggle in ways that surprised him. You ever been married? David asked one afternoon as they waited for Emma to finish a college prep session in the center's computer lab. The question surprised him. He hadn't been curious about another woman since Sarah's death. Alex's hands stilled on the forms she'd been organizing. I lost my husband and son in an accident. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, it's okay, Alex interrupted, though her voice carried the careful control of someone managing pain. It's been a while now. Some days are better than others. David nodded, recognizing the particular grief of sudden loss. How long were you married? 15 years. Tyler was 12 when she stopped, unable to finish the sentence even now. Your Emma reminds me of him sometimes. That combination of intelligence and determination that makes you believe kids can change the world. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that some wounds never fully healed, but could be carried with dignity. David found himself studying Alex's profile, noticing details he'd missed during their first chaotic meeting, the laugh lines around her eyes, the way she unconsciously twisted her wedding ring when talking about difficult cases, the genuine warmth that seemed to energize everyone around her. Alex, he said finally, would you like to have dinner with us sometime? Nothing fancy, just home cooking and Emma's endless questions about everything. You've been so good to our family, and I'd like to return the favor somehow. The invitation hung in the air between them, innocent and loaded simultaneously. Alex felt her heart rate increase in ways that had nothing to do with medical conditions. When was the last time someone had invited her anywhere as just herself, not as Alexandra Sterling, with her useful connections and inconvenient wealth? I'd like that very much, she heard herself say. The following Friday evening, Alex stood on the front porch of a modest two-story house on Maple Street, holding a bottle of wine that had cost $12 instead of her usual $300, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of designer clothes. The woman reflected in the front door's glass looked more like Alex Miller than she had in months. David answered the door in an apron that read, World's Greatest Dad, clearly a gift from Emma Flower, dusting his dark hair, and a smile that transformed his usually worried face into something approaching carefree. Alex, perfect timing. Emma's making her famous chocolate chip cookies, which means I'm trying to prevent her from eating all the cookie dough before they make it to the oven. The house smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, like childhood memories and family traditions. Emma appeared from the kitchen, her face flushed from baking and bright with excitement. Miss Miller, Dad's making his specialty grilled cheese and tomato soup. He says it's gourmet because he uses 3 different kinds of cheese. 4 kinds, David corrected with mock indignation. I added Gouda since we have company. The evening unfolded with the easy rhythm of people genuinely enjoying each other's company. Emma dominated conversation during dinner, regaling Alex with stories about her chemistry teacher's latest experiments and her plans for a science fair project on cardiac medications. David contributed running commentary and gentle teasing, the kind of family dynamic Alex had almost forgotten existed. After dinner, while Emma finished homework upstairs, David and Alex found themselves on the front porch swing, coffee cups warming their hands against the October chill. The neighborhood was settling into evening quiet, porch lights coming on the distant sound of televisions, and family conversations drifting through screen doors. This is nice, Alex said softly, meaning more than just a peaceful setting. For 3 hours, she'd been simply Alex Miller family friend rather than Alexandra Sterling, CEO in hiding. No board meetings to pretend to care about, no investment portfolios us requiring attention, no guilt about having survived when Marcus and Tyler hadn't. Emma really likes you, David observed. That's not something that happens often. She's usually pretty reserved with new people. She's an extraordinary young woman. You should be proud. I am. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough for her, you know. A 16-year-old girl needs more than a dad who barely made it through high school. Alex turned to study his profile in the porch light. David, you're raising a daughter who wants to become a doctor to help sick children. You're teaching her that hard work matters, that family comes first, that integrity isn't negotiable. What more could she possibly need? A mother, David said quietly. Someone who understands things I don't. Someone who can teach her about becoming a woman, about relationships, about... I don't know everything Sarah would have taught her. The raw honesty in his voice made Alex's chest tighten. Here was a man who'd taken on impossible odds and somehow managed to raise a remarkable daughter while building a business and maintaining his integrity. He was everything Marcus had been: solid, dependable, completely devoted to family, but somehow more accessible, more real. She's lucky to have you, Alex said finally. And for what it's worth, I think you're doing an amazing job. David looked at her, then really looked, and Alex felt something shift between them. The careful professional boundaries of their earlier relationship were dissolving into something more personal, more dangerous, more honest than anything she'd experienced since the accident. Would you like to do this again? David asked. Dinner, I mean. Maybe next week. Yes, Alex replied without hesitation. I'd like that very much. As she drove home to her modest Aurora apartment, Alex realized she was smiling for the first time in months. Not the polite social smile she wore to board meetings or charity events, but the genuine expression of someone who'd spent an evening exactly where she wanted to be. She was falling for David Morrison and his remarkable daughter. The thought should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to the safety of her penthouse and the familiar pain of her isolation. Instead, it felt like coming alive again. The transformation happened gradually, like seasons changing or flowers blooming so natural that none of them noticed, exactly when Alex Miller stopped being Emma's advocate and became part of the Morrison family fabric. It started with Tuesday evening dinners that extended into homework help, then Saturday morning pancakes that stretched into whole weekend days spent together until suddenly Alex's car in the driveway felt as normal as sunrise. Emma was the catalyst, her teenage enthusiasm bulldozing through the careful boundaries adults construct around new relationships. Miss Miller, can you help me with my college essay? Became also Alex. What do you think about this dress for homecoming? Which evolved into, Dad, Alex said she'd teach me to parallel park since you get too nervous. David found himself looking forward to Alex's arrival with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. She brought laughter back into their house, not the careful, protective humor he and Emma had cultivated since Sarah's death, but genuine joy that seemed to expand the very walls of their modest home. I think your father's trying to poison us, Alex announced one Sunday morning, examining the smoke detector's urgent beeping and David's latest culinary disaster. Emma dissolved into giggles as David stood in the kitchen doorway, spatula in hand, looking sheepish. The bacon got a little crispy, he defended. A little crispy, Emma gasped between laughs. Dad, it's literally charcoal. Alex, you have to teach him to cook something besides grilled cheese. Hey, David protested, but he was grinning. My grilled cheese is legendary. Legendarily basic, Emma shot back, earning a high five from Alex. Watching them together, David felt something in his chest that had been locked away since Sarah's death beginning to unfold. Alex didn't try to replace Emma's mother. She was too smart and too respectful for that. Instead, she created her own space in their family constellation, becoming the aunt Emma had never had, the friend David hadn't realized he had been missing. Alex, meanwhile, was experiencing her own quiet revolution. 18 months of grief had convinced her that the capacity for maternal love had died with Tyler, that she'd never again feel the fierce protectiveness and pride that came with watching a child grow. But Emma Morrison was systematically proving her wrong. I got accepted to the summer medical program at University of Colorado. Emma announced one evening in April, waving an acceptance letter like a victory flag. Full scholarship for high school students interested in healthcare careers. Alex felt tears spring to her eyes, the same tears she'd cried when Tyler made the traveling baseball team, when he'd won the science fair, when he'd done anything that proved he was becoming the remarkable person she'd always known he could be. Emma, that's incredible. Alex pulled the teenager into a hug that felt as natural as breathing. Dr. Martinez must have written you an amazing recommendation. Actually, Emma said, her voice muffled against Alex's shoulder, you did. Well, technically, you helped me write the essay, but you're the one who told me to focus on how being a patient made me want to become a better doctor. David watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, feeling his heart expand beyond the boundaries of his rib cage. When was the last time he'd seen Emma this purely uncomplicated happy? When was the last time their house had felt this full of possibility? The integration deepened through shared experiences that created their own family mythology. There was the great paint disaster of spring break, when Alex's attempt to help David refinish Emma's bedroom furniture resulted in paint on everything except the actual furniture. The camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park, where Alex proved surprisingly adept at building fires and completely hopeless at identifying edible plants. Emma's 16th birthday party, where Alex somehow convinced David to wear a ridiculous party hat while 50 teenagers descended on their backyard. I can't believe you talked me into this, David muttered, surveying the controlled chaos of teenagers playing volleyball and consuming alarming quantities of pizza. Emma wanted a real party, Alex replied, adjusting his crooked party hat with the casual intimacy of someone who'd earned the right to touch him without asking. Every 16-year-old deserves to feel celebrated. She is celebrated, David protested. We celebrate her every day. David Morrison, Alex said, her voice carrying fond exasperation. There's a difference between feeling loved and feeling celebrated. Trust me on this. She was right, of course. Emma glowed all afternoon, introducing Alex to her friends as basically my stepmom, with a casualness that made both adults exchange meaningful glances across the crowded yard. The easy way she claimed Alex's family, the unconscious assumption that this arrangement was permanent, it should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming home. The most significant shift came during Emma's routine cardiology appointment in late spring. Martinez had become accustomed to Alex's presence at these visits, noting her careful questions and obvious emotional investment in Emma's care. Her numbers continue to improve. Dr. Martinez announced, studying the latest echo results. Whatever you're doing at home, less stress, better nutrition, more emotional support, keep doing it. I'm actually comfortable postponing the surgery discussion for another 6 months. In the parking garage afterward, Emma threw her arms around both adults, simultaneously creating an awkward but perfect three-person hug that somehow captured everything their relationship had become. This is the best news we've had in years, Emma said, her voice thick with relief and joy. And it's because of you, Alex. You helped Dad stop worrying so much, and you made our house feel happy again. David felt Alex's shoulders shake slightly and realized she was crying, not the careful, controlled tears of grief he had witnessed before, but the overwhelming emotion of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be essential to another person's happiness. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, David and Alex sat on the front porch swing that had become their unofficial relationship headquarters. The spring air carried the scent of blooming lilacs and the distant sound of a neighbor's radio playing classic rock. She's right, you know, David said quietly, about you making our house happy again. I didn't realize how much we'd been just surviving until you showed us what living looked like. Alex leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. I forgot what it felt like to be needed for something that mattered. Not for what I could provide or fix, but just for being myself. Alex Miller, David said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You are extraordinary exactly as you are. If only he knew, Alex thought, but pushed the guilty voice away. Tonight she was Alex Miller, the woman who'd found her way into a carpenter's heart and his daughter's life through nothing more complicated than showing up and caring deeply. Tonight, the rest of her identity felt like someone else's problem. The integration was so complete that neighbors stopped asking who the woman in the Honda Civic was and started including her in community discussions. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow next door, began bringing over enough soup for 3 people instead of 2. The mailman delivered packages addressed to A. Miller without question. Emma's friends assumed Alex had always been part of the Morrison family constellation. By summer, the question wasn't whether Alex belonged. It was impossible to imagine the family without her. She knew Emma's schedule better than some parents knew their own children's. She could read David's moods from across a room, knew when his carpenter's back was aching, and when his veteran's nightmares were keeping him awake. She'd memorized Emma's medication schedule, David's coffee preferences, the precise way their house settled into evening quiet. They'd become a family in all the ways that mattered, bound together by choice and care, and the daily decision to show up for each other. The only thing missing was the complete honesty that real families required. That, Alex told herself, was a problem for another day. Tonight she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people who needed her, being exactly who she was meant to be. The fact that she was living a carefully constructed lie seemed less important than the truth of what they'd built together. Some truths she'd learned were more important than others. She just hoped that when the reckoning came, and it would come, the truth of their love would be stronger than the lies that had created it. The conversation that changed everything happened on a humid July evening, 3 months after Emma's encouraging cardiology report, and 6 months after Alex had first walked into their lives during that storm. David and Alex sat on the front porch swing, watching heat lightning flicker across the Colorado sky, while Emma slept peacefully upstairs, her first full night's rest in weeks, thanks to a new medication regimen that was finally working. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of thunder. His hand found Alex's in the darkness, fingers intertwining with the familiarity of couples who'd shared countless quiet moments. "What way?" Alex asked, though her heart was already racing with the anticipation of words that could change everything between them. "Happy," David replied simply. "Not just content or grateful or managing, actually happy, like the future might hold good things instead of just more survival." Alex felt tears prick her eyes. 6 months ago, she'd been a ghost, haunting her own life, going through the motions of existence while feeling fundamentally disconnected from anything that mattered. Now, sitting beside this remarkable man who'd somehow seen past her carefully constructed facade to love the woman underneath, she felt more real than she had since the accident. "I know what you mean," she whispered. "I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, something I'd used up my lifetime supply of." David turned to study her profile in the dim light filtering through the screen door. "Tell me about them, your husband and son, if you want to." Alex had been dreading and longing for this conversation in equal measure. She'd spoken about Marcus and Tyler to her grief counselor, to the well-meaning friends who tried to help her process the loss, but never to someone who might actually understand the specific weight of losing your entire world in a single moment. Marcus was everything good about ambition. She began carefully editing the truth but not the emotion. He worked hard but never at the expense of family. Success meant being able to provide for people he loved, not proving anything to the world. She paused, smiling at a memory. Tyler was 12 and completely convinced he could solve any problem through careful observation and logical thinking. He kept notebooks full of his theories about everything: why dogs seemed to understand human emotions, how to make the perfect peanut butter sandwich, whether aliens would appreciate jazz music. "He sounds like Emma," David observed. That combination of intellectual curiosity and absolute confidence that understanding leads to solutions. "Oh, yes," Alex agreed, surprised by how much comfort there was in that comparison. "He would have liked Emma. They would have been friends, I think. The kind of kids who discuss philosophy during lunch break and think that's perfectly normal." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, honoring the memory of a boy who would never get to meet the girl who reminded them both of possibility and potential. "The hardest part," Alex continued, "is that I was supposed to be on that plane. Last-minute meeting kept me home. For months, I couldn't figure out why I deserved to survive when they didn't." David's arm tightened around her shoulders. "And now I think maybe I survived so I could be here, with you and Emma. Maybe that's not selfish to think." "Alex," David said, turning so he could see her face fully, "the day you walked into our lives, you saved more than Emma's breathing. You saved both of us from forgetting that love was still possible." The kiss that followed was inevitable, tender, and loaded with months of careful affection, finally allowed to transform into something deeper. Alex felt her carefully maintained walls crumble as David's hands framed her face with the reverence of someone who understood that love was fragile and precious and worth protecting. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words slipping out before she could analyze their implications or consequences. "I love you too," David replied without hesitation. "I love your laugh and the way you argue with Emma about everything and how you make our house feel like a home instead of just a place we sleep." Over the following weeks, their relationship shifted into deeper intimacy with the natural progression of people who'd already built trust through smaller moments. Alex began staying overnight more frequently. First in the guest room Emma had enthusiastically decorated for her, then eventually in David's room when teenage wisdom declared that everyone was being ridiculously old-fashioned about the obvious. "Dad, she's already basically living here," Emma announced one morning over breakfast, with the exasperated tone teenagers reserved for adults who insisted on making simple things complicated. "Her coffee mug has a permanent spot in the cabinet. She knows where everything is better than some family members." Pointed look at David. "And last week she bought groceries without being asked. Just admit you're in love and stop tiptoeing around each other." "Emma Morrison," David protested, though he was fighting a smile. "You don't get to give relationship advice until you're at least 30. "Fine, but when I'm 30 and still traumatized by my parents' inability to communicate directly about their feelings, I'm sending you the therapy bills." Alex nearly choked on her coffee. "Did she just call us your parents?" "Technically, she called you both my parents," Emma clarified cheerfully. "Which is accurate since you're both currently parenting me, and badly, I might add. Real parents would have figured out the sleeping arrangements by now." The conversation that night after Emma had gone to bed was awkward and sweet and absolutely necessary. "Are we ready for this?" David asked, sitting beside Alex on his bed, their bed, potentially with the careful distance of someone navigating new territory. "I think we've been ready for months," Alex replied honestly. "The question is whether we're brave enough to admit it." They were, it turned out, brave enough for many things. Brave enough to share not just a bed, but morning routines and evening conversations, and the particular intimacy of couples who'd learned to read each other's moods and needs. Brave enough to discuss practical matters like grocery sharing and household responsibilities with the seriousness of people building something permanent. "I should probably contribute more to household expenses," Alex said one evening, as they planned Emma's senior year school supplies and college application fees. "I'm here most nights anyway, and Emma's college costs are going to be significant." "Alex, you already do more than your share," David protested. "The insurance appeals the scholarship applications the way you've helped Emma navigate the medical system. That's not the same as actual financial contribution," Alex interrupted carefully, not mentioning the anonymous donations that had been paying their major bills for months. "I have savings. Let me help with the things that matter." The discussion of money always made Alex's chest tight with guilt and complicated logistics. How much could Alex Miller reasonably contribute without raising questions about a social worker's salary? How could she help the people she loved without revealing the resources that would change everything between them? "We're partners," David said, finally the word carrying weight beyond mere romance. "Partners share burdens and benefits. If you want to contribute more, we figure out what works for all of us." Partners. The words settled into Alex's heart like a promise and a responsibility. Marcus had been her partner in building an empire, but David was her partner in building a life. The difference felt revolutionary. Their most profound conversation happened in late August as Emma prepared for her senior year and college applications loomed with all their financial implications. "What do you want?" David asked one night as they lay in the darkness, Alex's head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Not for Emma, not for us and as a family. What does Alex Miller want for her own life?" The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For months, she'd been so focused on being what David and Emma needed that she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to have desires beyond service to others. "I want to wake up in this bed every morning for the rest of my life," she said finally. "I want to watch Emma become the doctor she's meant to be. I want to grow old with you arguing about whose turn it is to fix the leaky faucet and whether Emma's calling home enough from college." "That's what I want too," David said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Ordinary happiness with extraordinary people. Alex felt tears slide down her cheeks in the darkness. Ordinary happiness, such a simple dream that had once seemed impossible. The woman who owned half of downtown Denver was crying over the prospect of a lifetime of small, domestic pleasures with a carpenter and his daughter. "David," she whispered, "what if there are things about me you don't know? Important things. Are you married to someone else? No. Are you actually a criminal mastermind?" Despite her tears, Alex laughed. "No. Are you planning to hurt Emma or abandon us?" "Never. Then we'll figure out everything else together," David said with the confidence of someone who'd learned that love was built through daily choices, not perfect circumstances. "Whatever secrets you think you're carrying, they can't be bigger than what we've already survived." Alex wanted to tell him everything then about Sterling Properties, about the money that could solve every problem they faced, and about the elaborate deception that had allowed them to fall in love. The words formed and reformed in her throat, but she couldn't force them past the terror of losing this perfect, fragile thing they'd built together. Instead, she held him tighter and promised herself that someday soon she'd find the courage to risk everything for the chance at complete honesty. Someday soon she would tell him the truth and trust their love to survive it. But not tonight. Tonight she was just Alex Miller, loved and loving in return, planning an ordinary future with extraordinary people. The truth could wait one more day. The first significant financial intervention happened in September, when Emma's senior year expenses threatened to derail her college dreams before they'd even begun. The cost of SAT prep courses, college application fees, and the advanced placement exams required for competitive pre-med programs added up to nearly $3,000, money the Morrison family simply didn't have. Alex watched David spread bills across the kitchen table, with the grim concentration of a general planning an impossible battle. Emma's college counselor had been clear: without stellar test scores and a robust academic record, scholarship opportunities would be limited. But stellar preparation required resources that made David's carpenter salary stretch beyond its breaking point. "Maybe I could take the SATs without the prep course," Emma suggested, though her voice carried the hollow optimism of someone trying to convince herself that hope alone could overcome systemic disadvantage. "Lots of kids do fine just studying on their own." "Lots of kids," David replied quietly, "don't have your potential. You deserve every advantage we can give you." Alex felt her heart break watching them navigate yet another moment where poverty threatened to limit possibilities. This was exactly the kind of problem her real resources could solve in minutes. But Alex Miller's social worker salary couldn't justify spending $3,000 on test preparation. The solution came through careful research and creative accounting. Aurora Community Center had received an anonymous donation specifically designated for college preparation assistance for high-achieving, low-income students. The donor, channeled through a shell company Alex had established months earlier, had specified that funds should be used for SAT preparation, application fees, and academic support services. "I can't believe it," Emma said, clutching the acceptance letter for the premier college prep program in Denver. "Full scholarship, including transportation and lunch. How did I even get selected?" Alex maintained careful composure while explaining the center's new initiative, how Emma's academic record and financial need had made her an ideal candidate, how sometimes good things really did happen to deserving people. She didn't mention the hours she'd spent crafting the selection criteria to ensure Emma would be the obvious choice, or the additional funds she'd allocated to help 5 other students whose applications had genuinely impressed her. The anonymous support escalated throughout the fall as Alex identified more areas where modest financial intervention could dramatically improve the Morrison family's quality of life. David's truck, held together primarily through determination and prayer, received a mysterious insurance settlement for damage he didn't remember filing a claim for. The settlement covered exactly enough for a reliable used vehicle that wouldn't leave him stranded between job sites. "I swear I don't remember filing this claim," David told Alex, studying the insurance paperwork with confusion and gratitude. "But the adjuster said it was for storm damage from last year's flooding." "I guess when you're dealing with Emma's medical crisis, paperwork doesn't seem important." Alex nodded sympathetically while mentally noting to ensure future interventions included more comprehensive backstories. The learning curve of anonymous philanthropy was steeper than she'd anticipated. The most complex operation involved Emma's ongoing medical expenses. Dr. Martinez had recommended a new cardiac medication that showed promising results but wasn't covered by their insurance plan. The monthly cost of $800 was simply impossible for a family already struggling with basic expenses. Alex spent weeks researching pharmaceutical assistance programs, patient advocacy groups, and clinical trial opportunities before discovering that Aurora Medical Foundation, a nonprofit she'd quietly established, had received a substantial grant for uninsured cardiac patients under 18. The foundation's criteria were specific patients with demonstrated financial need, academic achievement indicating potential for future healthcare careers, and family stability, suggesting long-term medication compliance. Emma Morrison was again the perfect candidate. "This is incredible," Dr. Martinez said, reviewing the foundation's acceptance letter during Emma's October appointment. Aurora Medical Foundation is relatively new, but they're already developing a reputation for comprehensive patient support. They'll cover not just the medication, but also additional monitoring that your insurance doesn't approve. "How did we even get considered?" David asked. "I've never heard of them." "They identify promising candidates through hospital records and physician referrals," Alex explained, repeating the carefully crafted story she'd developed. Dr. Martinez nominated Emma based on her medical history and academic goals. What she didn't mention was the extensive background investigation she'd commissioned to ensure the Morrison family's genuine need and integrity before committing to long-term support. The private detective's report had confirmed everything Alex already knew. David Morrison was exactly who he appeared to be, a devoted father working himself to exhaustion to provide for his daughter's dreams. By December, Alex was managing an increasingly complex web of anonymous support that required constant attention to detail and plausible explanation. Shell companies' fictional foundations carefully timed coincidences that placed resources exactly where the Morrison family needed them. She'd become adept at manufacturing legitimate-seeming opportunities that just happened to benefit the people she loved. The guilt was becoming as overwhelming as the logistics. Every grateful smile from Emma, every expression of relief from David, when unexpected help materialized, felt like evidence of her fundamental dishonesty. She was helping them, yes, but she was also manipulating their circumstances in ways that made their autonomy and dignity suspect. "Alex, I need to talk to you about something," David said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Emma had gone upstairs to work on college essays, leaving them alone in the kitchen where so many of their important conversations seemed to happen. Alex's heart rate spiked. Had he discovered something? Had her careful construction of plausible explanations finally developed a crack large enough for suspicion to creep through? "What's on your mind?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady while loading dishes into the dishwasher. "All these good things that keep happening to us," David said, leaning against the counter, with the casual pose of someone discussing the weather rather than potentially exposing her entire deception. "Emma's scholarship, my insurance settlement, the medical foundation, that seems designed specifically for our situation. It's starting to feel like more than coincidence." Alex's hands stilled on the plates. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and somehow hoping for simultaneously. The chance to come clean, to trust their love, enough to risk everything on honesty. "What are you suggesting?" she asked carefully. "I'm wondering if you've been making some of these opportunities happen." David continued, his voice gentle but direct. "Not that I'm complaining, but the timing of everything, the way these programs seem tailored to Emma's specific needs. It makes me think someone who understands the system might be advocating for us behind the scenes." Alex felt relief and terror in equal measure. He was so close to the truth, but still so far from understanding the actual scope of her deception. "David, and if I had the kind of resources you're suggesting, don't you think I'd be living differently than I am?" She deflected, hating herself for the continued lies. "Social workers don't exactly have money to throw around." "That's what's confusing me," David admitted, "because you're clearly not wealthy, but you know things about navigating systems that most people don't learn without reason. And you care about us enough to spend enormous amounts of time and energy making sure we get help we need." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's appearance at the top of the stairs, calling down about a question on her scholarship application. The moment passed, but Alex could see that David's suspicions hadn't been satisfied, merely postponed. Later that night, lying beside David in the darkness, Alex listened to his breathing settle into sleep, while her mind raced through scenarios and consequences. Her carefully constructed double life was becoming unsustainable. The logistics were increasingly complex. The guilt was eating away at her sense of self, and David was too intelligent and too observant to accept coincidence as explanation indefinitely. She'd reached the point where maintaining her deception required more energy than simply telling the truth and dealing with the consequences. But the consequences felt enormous. Not just the risk of losing David and Emma's love, but the certainty that everything they'd built together would be contaminated by questions about motivation and authenticity. Did David love Alex Miller, the struggling social worker who understood their problems because she shared them? Or could he love Alexander Sterling, the billionaire who'd been playing dress-up in his world while secretly solving his problems with resources he couldn't dream of accessing? The anonymous support had started as a way to help without changing the fundamental dynamic of their relationship. Now it felt like the foundation of a house of cards that would collapse the moment anyone examined it too closely. Alex closed her eyes and tried to imagine a conversation where she explained everything: the real identity, the money, the careful manipulation of their circumstances, the elaborate deception that had allowed them to fall in love. In every scenario she constructed, the conversation ended with betrayal and heartbreak. But continuing the lies felt like its own betrayal, a daily choice to prioritize her fear over their right to make informed decisions about their own lives. Something would have to give soon. The only question was whether she'd find the courage to control the revelation or whether circumstances would force the truth into the open in ways she couldn't manage. Either way, the reckoning was coming, and Alex Miller was running out of time to decide whether she trusted love enough to survive complete honesty. The first crack in Alex's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in January, when Emma Morrison approached her college counselor with questions that would have been routine for any other high-achieving senior, but proved dangerous for someone living an elaborate lie. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't find any information about Aurora Medical Foundation online," Emma said, settling into the familiar chair across from the counselor's desk. Around them, the guidance office buzzed with the controlled chaos of senior year transcript requests, scholarship deadlines, and the particular anxiety of 17-year-olds whose entire futures seemed to hinge on decisions made by admissions committees they'd never meet. Mrs. Henderson, a veteran counselor who'd helped hundreds of students navigate the complexities of college financing, looked up from her computer with mild surprise. "That's the foundation that's been covering your cardiac medication, right? The one that Dr. Martinez connected you with?" "Yes, but when I search for them online to include them in my scholarship essays as an example of community support, I can't find a website or news articles or even basic information about their other programs." Emma explained, her analytical mind approaching the problem with the same methodical precision she applied to chemistry equations. "For a foundation that's supposedly helping multiple patients, they have remarkably little public presence." The observation hung in the air between them like a question neither woman was quite ready to ask directly. Mrs. Henderson had been working in college counseling for 15 years, long enough to recognize when circumstances seemed too perfectly aligned, too specifically tailored to individual need. Sometimes smaller foundations keep a low profile. Mrs. Henderson offered, though her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who knew that legitimate nonprofits usually wanted public recognition for their work. "Have you asked Alex about it? She seems to know quite a bit about medical advocacy resources." Emma nodded, though the suggestion felt strangely uncomfortable. Over the past year, Alex had become the person she turned to for advice about everything from college applications to relationship questions. But lately, some of Alex's explanations had begun to feel incomplete, not dishonest exactly, but carefully constructed in ways that avoided deeper inquiry. "There's something else," Emma continued, her voice dropping to the confidential tone teenagers used when sharing information that felt important but potentially troubling. "The scholarship I received for SAT prep, when I try to research the donor to write thank you letters, the community center says they have to respect the donor's privacy. But Mrs. Patterson at the front desk mentioned that the donation came through a company called Miller Educational Services." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. The coincidence of a company sharing Alex Miller's last name providing a scholarship that perfectly met Emma Morrison's specific needs was notable. "That could absolutely be a coincidence," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "Miller is a common name, and educational service companies often make targeted donations to community organizations." But Emma was already pulling out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with the focused intensity of someone following a digital trail. Miller Educational Services was incorporated 6 months ago in Delaware. She read from the search results. No website, no listed programs, and the registered agent is a law firm that specializes in privacy services for high net worth individuals. The silence that followed was charged with implications neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. Emma stared at her phone screen, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving, beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that didn't make sense. Emma misses. Henderson said gently, "What exactly are you thinking, I'm thinking that either I'm the luckiest person in Colorado or someone has been very carefully making sure that my family gets exactly the help we need, exactly when we need it." Emma replied, her voice carrying the particular mixture of gratitude and unease that came with suspecting that your good fortune might not be as random as it appeared. The investigation that followed consumed Emma's attention for the next 3 weeks, transforming her from grateful scholarship recipient to amateur detective. She approached the mystery with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to scientific experiments, creating spreadsheets and timelines that mapped the Morrison family's extraordinary run of good luck. The insurance settlement that had allowed her father to replace his unreliable truck, filed and processed with unusual speed by an adjuster who couldn't quite explain why the claim had been prioritized. The medical foundation that covered her expensive cardiac medication, established just weeks before her diagnosis, required the specific treatment they provided. The college preparation scholarship that had launched her toward her dreams, funded by a company that existed primarily on paper and seemed to have no other beneficiaries. "Dad, when exactly did your insurance company call about the truck settlement?" Emma asked one evening, her laptop open to a timeline she'd been constructing for days. David looked up from the cabinet he was refinishing, surprised by the specificity of her question. "I don't know, honey. Sometime in October, I think." "Why?" "Just curious about the timing," Emma replied, making a note in her spreadsheet. October, 3 weeks after Alex had commented that his truck was becoming unreliable enough to be dangerous, 2 weeks after a particularly stressful evening when the vehicle had broken down on the way to Emma's cardiology appointment. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Every stroke of good fortune in their lives over the past year could be traced to a moment when Alex had witnessed their need, followed by the timely appearance of assistance that seemed specifically designed to address their exact circumstances. Emma stared at her computer screen, feeling the ground shift beneath her, understanding of the past year. If Alex was somehow responsible for orchestrating their good fortune, it meant either she had access to resources far beyond what a social worker should possess, or she had connections and influence that she'd been hiding from them. Both possibilities felt like betrayal, but for different reasons. The final piece of evidence came through pure accident. Emma was helping Alex organize paperwork in her apartment when a credit card fell from between the pages of a medical journal. The name on the card read Alexandra Sterling, not Alex Miller. Emma stared at the plastic rectangle in her palm, her mind racing through the implications of a false identity. Who was Alex Miller really? And why had she been living under an assumed name while systematically improving their lives through anonymous generosity? The Google search that followed revealed everything. Alexandra Sterling, CEO of Sterling Properties, estimated net worth exceeding $500 million. Recent widow who'd lost her husband and son in a private plane crash 18 months ago. Philanthropist, business leader, member of Denver's social elite. And according to recent business journals, a woman who'd been notably absent from public events and corporate activities over the past year, leading to speculation about her mental health and business capacity following her family's tragic death. Emma sat in Alex's modest apartment, surrounded by the carefully constructed evidence of a middle-class life, staring at photographs of the woman she'd come to love as a second mother, dressed in designer gowns and shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. Everything she thought she knew about Alex Miller was a lie. The job at the community center, the modest lifestyle, the shared understanding of financial struggle, all of it was performance art by a billionaire who'd been playing dress-up in their lives while secretly solving their problems with pocket change. The betrayal felt complete and overwhelming. Not just because Alex had lied about who she was, but because she'd allowed Emma and her father to feel grateful for help they'd never asked for, assistance that came from resources so vast that their family's entire financial crisis represented a rounding error in Alex's investment portfolio. Emma closed the laptop and sat in the growing darkness of the apartment, feeling like everything solid in her world had suddenly become quicksand. The woman who'd taught her to parallel park and helped with college essays and listened to her dreams about medical school was a stranger wearing a carefully constructed mask. The question now was whether she should confront Alex directly or tell her father first, and let him decide how to handle the revelation that their guardian angel was actually a grieving billionaire who'd been conducting an elaborate social experiment with their lives. Either way, the family they'd built together over the past year was about to be tested by the kind of truth that changed everything. Emma pulled out her phone and started typing a text to her father. "Dad, we need to talk tonight. Something important about Alex." Then she deleted it and tried again. "Dad, I found something you need to see." Delete. Start over. How do you tell someone that their love story might have been built on a foundation of lies? How do you explain that the woman who'd saved your family might have been playing a role the entire time Emma stared at the blank text message, paralyzed by the weight of knowledge she didn't want to carry alone? Outside the window, Aurora's streetlights began to flicker on, illuminating the modest neighborhood where Alex Miller lived, her carefully constructed lie, just minutes away from the penthouse where Alexandra Sterling conducted her real life. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, Emma Morrison sat in the growing darkness and mourned for the simple truth she was about to destroy forever. The confrontation happened 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon when David was supposed to be at the hardware store and Emma was supposed to be at debate practice. Instead, they sat in Alex's Honda Civic outside the gleaming tower that housed Sterling Properties, watching through 30 floors of glass windows as the woman they knew as Alex Miller transformed back into Alexandra Sterling. "There," Emma said quietly, pointing to a figure visible through the conference room windows. 32nd floor corner office. David squinted upward, struggling to reconcile the tiny silhouette with the woman who'd made him coffee that morning in his own kitchen, wearing jeans and one of his old sweatshirts while helping Emma study for her AP chemistry exam. Even from this distance, the differences were stark. The Alexandra Sterling visible through those windows moved with the polished confidence of corporate leadership, her posture and gestures speaking a language of authority and control that Alex Miller had never exhibited. This woman commanded rooms full of people whose individual salaries probably exceeded David's annual income. "She's been lying to us for over a year," Emma said, her voice carrying the particular hurt of someone who'd trusted completely and been completely deceived. "Everything we thought we knew about her, everything she told us about her life, her background, it's all been fake." David continued staring upward, his carpenter's mind automatically calculating the cost of the building they were parked beside, the kind of money required to occupy corner offices and towers that scraped the Colorado sky. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd shared his bed and his dreams and his daughter's affection, was literally living in a different world when she wasn't playing house with his family. "How did you figure it out?" he asked finally, though part of him already knew the answer. Emma had inherited her mother's analytical intelligence and her father's stubborn persistence. Once she'd started questioning coincidences, uncovering the truth had probably been inevitable. Emma pulled out her phone and showed him the screenshots she'd compiled, news articles about Alexandra Sterling's Business Empire Society page, photos from charity galas, financial reports detailing a net worth that made their family's struggles seem like someone else's fiction. "The credit card was what made me look deeper," Emma explained. "But once I started really examining all the lucky breaks we've had over the past year, the pattern was obvious. Aurora Medical Foundation was established 6 weeks before I needed that cardiac medication. Miller Educational Services incorporated 3 days before the community center announced that mysterious scholarship program. The insurance settlement Dad received was processed by a company that Sterling Properties owns a controlling interest in." David felt something cold and hard settling in his chest, and as the scope of the deception became clear. It wasn't just that Alex had lied about her identity. She'd been systematically manipulating their lives, solving their problems with money they'd never known existed, allowing them to feel grateful for assistance that represented pocket change to her real financial situation. "She's been playing us," he said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Our entire relationship has been her charity project." "Dad, I don't think—" "Emma, look at that building," David interrupted, his voice hardening with hurt and anger. "Look at where she actually lives, who she actually is. We've been entertainment for her. Poor people she could help feel better about herself. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. The Sterling Properties lobby was all marble and glass and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. The receptionist who announced their arrival spoke with the polished professionalism of someone accustomed to handling billionaires in their appointments. "Mr. Morrison and Miss Morrison are here to see Ms. Sterling," she said into her headset, her voice carrying no recognition of the extraordinary nature of this visit. Alex Alexandra appeared in the lobby within minutes, still wearing the tailored suit and designer heels that marked her as belonging to this world of power and privilege. For a moment, seeing her in this context, David felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. "David, Emma, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice carrying a surprise and something that looked like fear. "We could ask you the same question," Emma replied, her teenage directness cutting through any possibility of deflection. "Although I guess the better question is, who are you really?" The color drained from Alex's face as she realized that her carefully constructed double life had finally collided with itself. Around them, the lobby continued its normal rhythm of business executives arriving for meetings, assistants delivering documents, the quiet efficiency of an empire that ran itself, while its owner played house with a carpenter and his daughter. "Can we go somewhere private to talk?" Alex asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," David said, the finality in his voice surprising all three of them. "We're not going anywhere with you. We don't even know who you are." David, please let me explain." "Explain what?" David demanded, his hurt and anger finally finding their voice. "How you've been lying to us for over a year. How our entire relationship has been based on you pretending to be someone you're not. How you've been secretly solving our problems with money we never knew you had." The words echoed through the marble lobby, drawing attention from other visitors who were trying to pretend they weren't witnessing a very public, very personal confrontation. "Every moment of gratitude, every time we thanked you for helping us navigate systems you actually own every night, you let us worry about money while sitting on a fortune that could solve every problem we've ever had." David continued, his voice growing louder with each accusation. "Was any of it real? Or have we just been your entertainment?" Alex's face was pale with shock and pain, but David was beyond caring about her feelings. The woman standing before him in designer clothes and corporate authority was a stranger who'd been wearing Alex Miller's face while conducting an elaborate experiment with his family's emotions. "You made us feel grateful for scraps when you could have solved everything," he said, finally, his voice breaking with the weight of betrayal. "You let us struggle while you had resources to help, and then you helped secretly, so we'd never know how much you were capable of. What kind of person does that to people they claim to love?" The question hung in the air between them, like an accusation and a plea, encompassing everything that had been destroyed in the space of 3 days' worth of investigation and one devastating revelation. Alexandra Sterling had answers, explanations, justifications for everything she'd done. But Alex Miller, the woman David Morrison had fallen in love with, was gone forever, revealed as nothing more than an elaborate performance by someone who'd apparently found their poverty entertaining enough to subsidize. The conference room Alex led them to was a temple to corporate success, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of Denver, a mahogany table that could seat 20, and walls lined with awards and photographs documenting decades of business achievement. Emma and David sat on one side of the vast table while Alex Alexandra took the chair across from them, the physical distance feeling symbolic of the emotional chasm that had opened between them. "Before you say anything," David began, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who'd spent 3 days processing betrayal. "I need you to understand something. The woman I fell in love with was Alex Miller. The woman who helped Emma with her homework, who made coffee in my kitchen every morning, who cried during sad movies and got excited about Emma's college prospects. That woman doesn't exist, does she?" Alex felt her chest tighten as she looked across the table at two people who'd become her entire world, who were now staring at her like she was a stranger wearing a familiar face. "David, that woman is me. Everything you fell in love with, everything Emma responded to that was real." "Really?" Emma's voice carried the particular edge of intelligent teenagers who'd been underestimated and were prepared to prove their sophistication. "Because Alex Miller struggles to pay rent and worries about medical bills and relates to families like ours because she understands financial pressure. Alexandra Sterling owns half of downtown Denver, and considers our family's entire annual income to be rounding error in her investment portfolio. And the precision of Emma's analysis cut deeper than any emotional accusation could have. This remarkable young woman had approached their relationship like a scientific experiment, gathering data and drawing conclusions based on evidence rather than sentiment. The woman who sat in our kitchen talking about how hard it was to make ends meet while secretly paying our bills through shell companies and fake foundations. Emma continued, her voice rising with anger and hurt. The woman who let my father feel guilty about not being able to provide better opportunities for me, while she could have written a check that would have solved every financial problem we've ever had. Which one of those women is real, Alex? Both, Alex said desperately, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Emma, I know this looks terrible, but you have to understand, I never meant for it to become so complicated. Complicated? David's laugh held no humor. You call systematically lying to people you claim to love complicated? You call manipulating our circumstances while pretending to share our struggles complicated? Alex watched David's face cycle through emotions: hurt, anger, disgust, and something that looked almost like mourning. He was grieving for Alex Miller, she realized, for the woman he'd believed her to be, and the relationship he'd thought they'd built together. I was grieving, Alex said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. When Marcus and Tyler died, I wanted to disappear from my life, from the world that reminded me of everything I'd lost. Working at the community center as Alex Miller was supposed to be temporary, just a way to do something meaningful while I figured out how to keep living. And we were what therapy, David demanded, a convenient way for you to feel better about having survived when your family didn't. The accuracy of his accusation made Alex flinch. It started that way, she admitted, the honesty feeling like self-destruction. But it became something else. You and Emma became everything that mattered to me. While you were lying into us every single day. Emma pointed out her scientific precision, turning emotional devastation into logical argument. While you were letting us worry about money and feel grateful for help we never asked for. While you were making decisions about our lives using resources we didn't know existed. Alex looked around the conference room at the evidence of wealth and power that surrounded them and realized how impossible it would be to explain the loneliness of having unlimited resources and nothing that mattered to spend them on. I was afraid, she said finally, afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me differently. That David would wonder if I was trying to buy his affection, that Emma would feel awkward about our friendship, knowing I could solve every problem in her life with a phone call. So instead, you decided to solve our problems secretly while pretending to be poor. David said, his voice filled with bitter understanding. You thought it was better to lie to us than to trust us with the truth. David, if I told you I was worth $500 million on our second date, would you have believed that my feelings for you were genuine? We'll never know, will we? David replied, standing up from the table with the finality of someone who'd heard enough. Because you never gave us the chance to prove that we could handle the truth. You decided for us that we weren't trustworthy enough, weren't sophisticated enough, weren't worthy enough to know who you really were. Emma stood beside her father, and Alex felt her heart break watching them unite against her. This remarkable young woman, who'd become like a daughter to her, who'd filled the Tyler-shaped hole in her heart, was looking at her with the kind of disappointment that felt worse than anger. Alex, Emma said, and the name sounded wrong in her mouth now, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. Did you ever consider that maybe we would have loved you for who you actually are? That maybe the money wouldn't have mattered if you'd been honest from the beginning? The question hung in the air like an indictment of every choice Alex had made since the night she'd stopped to help a stranded truck in a flood. Every moment of deception, every carefully constructed lie, every anonymous donation had been based on the assumption that David and Emma couldn't handle the truth of her wealth and loss. I was trying to protect what we had, Alex said, though the explanation sounded pathetic even to her own ears. What we had was built on lies, David replied, his voice carrying the finality of someone who'd made a decision he wouldn't reconsider. How can we trust anything about our relationship when the foundation was false from the beginning? David, please, no, he said, already moving toward the door. Emma and I need to go home and figure out how to rebuild our lives without wondering which parts were real and which parts were just your charity project. As they reached the conference room door, Emma turned back for one final moment. For what it's worth, Alex Miller was someone I could have loved forever. I just wish I'd gotten the chance to meet Alexandra Sterling, honestly, instead of discovering that the person I trusted most was living a lie. The door closed behind them with the soft finality of expensive engineering, leaving Alex alone in a conference room that suddenly felt like a mausoleum for everything she'd lost, not once but twice. First Marcus and Tyler in a plane crash she couldn't prevent. Now David and Emma through choices she'd made every single day for over a year. Outside the windows, Denver sprawled beneath her like a kingdom she'd inherited but never wanted to rule. Somewhere in that landscape, the Morrison family was driving home to their modest house on Maple Street, trying to figure out which parts of the past year had been genuine and which parts had been elaborate theater performed by a billionaire who'd been too afraid to risk loving them honestly. Alex pressed her palms against the cool glass and wondered if there was any way back from the kind of betrayal that poisoned every memory, every moment of happiness, every declaration of love they'd shared. The woman in the reflection looking back at her was definitely Alexandra Sterling, polished, powerful, and completely alone. Alex Miller, with all her flaws and fears and genuine love for a carpenter and his daughter, is gone forever. The silence in David Morrison's house that Friday night was different from any quiet they'd experienced since Sarah's death. This wasn't the peaceful hush of a family and settling into evening routine, or the contemplative stillness that followed difficult conversations about medical bills and uncertain futures. This was the hollow emptiness of a space that had suddenly lost its center of gravity. Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at homework she couldn't concentrate on, while David moved through their modest home like a man cataloging evidence of his own gullibility. Alex's coffee mug, the blue ceramic one with a chip in the handle that she'd claimed from their cabinet months ago, sat unwashed in the sink. Her reading glasses were folded on the counter beside a stack of college brochures she'd been helping Emma organize. The spare phone charger she'd bought for convenience was still plugged into the outlet by the couch where she'd spent countless evenings helping with homework and watching ridiculous reality TV shows that made all three of them laugh. Every object felt like proof of how thoroughly Alexandra Sterling had infiltrated their lives while pretending to be someone else entirely. "Dad," Emma said finally, her voice cutting through the oppressive quiet, "what do we do with all her stuff?" David looked around their living room, suddenly seeing it through different eyes. The throw pillow Alex had bought because it made the couch more comfortable, had that been a genuine impulse or a wealthy woman unconsciously upgrading their modest furnishings? The houseplants she'd brought over, gradually claiming they were extras from her apartment, had she been slowly trying to improve their living space without making them feel inadequate? "I don't know," David admitted, sinking into his recliner and immediately regretting it. This was where Alex had curled up beside him countless evenings, her head on his shoulder, while they planned weekend activities or discussed Emma's college prospects. Now the chair felt too big, too empty, contaminated by memories that might have been genuine or might have been performance art. "The worst part," Emma continued, closing her chemistry textbook with more force than necessary, "is that I can't tell which moments were real. Like when she helped me practice for the debate team tryouts, was she actually interested in my arguments about healthcare policy, or was she just amusing herself by watching a poor kid struggle with concepts she probably understood better than anyone?" David felt his chest tighten with recognition. That was exactly the question that had been torturing him since they'd left Sterling Properties 3 hours ago. When Alex had laughed at his stories about difficult customers, when she'd gotten genuinely excited about Emma's academic achievements, when she'd cried during the movie about the father who sacrificed everything for his daughter's dreams, which of those moments had involved Alex Miller's authentic emotions and which had been Alexandra Sterling conducting an elaborate social experiment? "She said she loved us," Emma said, her voice carrying the particular hurt of someone who'd believed completely and been completely deceived. "She said we were her family." "But how can you love people you're lying to every single day?" The question hit David like a physical blow because it encompassed everything that felt wrong about their situation. Love required honesty, trust the vulnerability that came with being known completely by another person. Alexandra Sterling had known everything about their struggles, their fears, their dreams, while they'd known nothing real about her circumstances, her motivations, or her actual capacity to help them. "Maybe she did love us," David said slowly, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Maybe that's what makes this so much worse. Maybe she loved us enough to want to help, but not enough to trust us with the truth. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message, and David watched her face cycle through hope, disappointment, and renewed anger as she read the screen. "It's from her," Emma said, showing him the message. "She wants to explain everything. She says we mean too much to her to lose without a fight." David stared at the phone screen, feeling exhausted by the thought of more explanations, more carefully crafted justifications for over a year of systematic deception. What could Alexandra Sterling possibly say that would make their relationship feel authentic again? "What do you want to do?" he asked Emma, though he already knew his own answer. "I want to understand why," Emma replied, her scientific mind still seeking logical explanations for emotional devastation. "I want to know if any of it was real, or if we were just her way of dealing with grief by playing house with people who reminded her of the family she lost." The brutal honesty of Emma's analysis made David wince. Had they been surrogate family members for a woman who'd lost her husband and son? Had Alex's affection for Emma been genuine, or had she been projecting her dead son onto a teenage girl who happened to be intelligent and ambitious? "Emma, I think we need some time to process this before we talk to her again," David said carefully. "Right now, I'm too angry to have a rational conversation, and you're too hurt to get the answers you deserve." "But what if she just disappears?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the fear of abandonment that had lived beneath the surface since her mother's death. "What if she decides we're too much trouble and goes back to her real life?" David felt his heart break for his daughter, who'd found a maternal figure she'd trusted completely, only to discover that everything about that relationship had been built on deception. Emma had already lost one mother to cancer. Now she was losing another to betrayal, and the parallel felt devastating. "Honey, if she disappears without fighting for us, then we'll know that our love never meant as much to her as hers meant to us," David said, pulling Emma into a hug that felt like the only honest thing in their suddenly uncertain world. "And if that's true, then we're better off knowing it now." They ordered pizza for dinner, the first meal in months that Alex hadn't been involved in planning, preparing, or sharing. David found himself automatically setting 3 places at the table before catching himself and removing the extra plate with movements that felt like erasure. Emma picked at her food, clearly struggling with the same questions that were tormenting her father. "Dad, do you think she ever actually needed us, or were we just her way of feeling useful while she figured out how to live without her real family?" The question hung between them like an indictment of their own naivety. They'd believed they were building something mutual reciprocal based on shared challenges and genuine affection. Now they had to consider the possibility that they'd been charity cases, people whose struggles had made Alexandra Sterling feel better about her own enormous privilege and recent loss. "I don't know," David admitted, the honesty feeling like failure. "I thought I knew her, but apparently I never met the real woman. Alex Miller was just a character she was playing." "But Alex Miller felt real," Emma protested, though her voice carried more confusion than conviction. "The way she listened when I talked about wanting to be a doctor, the way she remembered details about our lives, the way she seemed to actually care about our problems. That couldn't all have been fake, could it?" David wished he had answers for his daughter, wished he could provide the certainty that would help them both navigate this new landscape of doubt and betrayal. But the truth was that he didn't know which parts of Alexandra Sterling's performance had been authentic and which parts had been elaborate method acting by a woman with unlimited resources and apparently unlimited capacity for deception. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, though he wasn't sure how. "We'll take some time to think, and then we'll decide what we need to know and whether we trust her enough to believe her answers." As they cleaned up dinner, David found himself moving through routines that Alex had helped establish, loading the dishwasher in the specific way she'd suggested for better cleaning, wiping the counters with the technique she'd learned from some domestic management course he'd assumed she'd taken as a struggling, single woman, rather than as a billionaire preparing to play house with a carpenter and his daughter. Every familiar action felt contaminated by the possibility that it had been part of Alexandra Sterling's elaborate research into how normal people lived their normal lives. That night, David lay on his couch. He couldn't face sleeping in the bed they'd shared, staring at the ceiling and wondering if there was any way back from the kind of betrayal that poisoned every memory, every moment of happiness, every declaration of love they'd shared. Somewhere across town, Alexandra Sterling was probably sleeping in a penthouse that cost more than most people's houses, surrounded by luxury beyond his comprehension, possibly already planning her next charitable project or social experiment. And Alex Miller, the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd made their house feel like a home again, was gone forever, revealed as nothing more than an elaborate performance by someone who'd apparently found their poverty interesting enough to subsidize but not honest enough to address directly. David closed his eyes and tried to imagine a future that didn't include the woman who'd taught him to love again, who'd shown Emma that mother figures could be found in unexpected places, who'd made them both believe that their family could be complete again despite everything they'd lost. The silence in the house settled deeper, and David Morrison fell asleep, wondering if they'd ever feel whole again, or if Alexandra Sterling had taken something essential with her when she'd returned to her real life 30 floors above the world, where normal people lived and loved and struggled with ordinary problems. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Sterling Properties, David Morrison's life had begun unraveling with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. The careful routines that had sustained him through 3 years of single parenthood crumbled as he discovered how much of his recent stability had depended on support systems he'd never known existed. The first casualty was his sleep. Without Alex's presence beside him, David found himself lying awake until dawn, his mind cycling endlessly through memories that now felt contaminated by deception. Every conversation they'd shared about financial stress took on new meaning when filtered through the knowledge that she could have solved their problems with a phone call. Every moment of intimacy felt suspicious, possibly calculated, maybe just another part of her elaborate performance, as a woman who understood struggle because she shared it. His work began suffering immediately. Carpentry required precision, patience, and the kind of focused attention that was impossible when your mind was constantly parsing the difference between authentic affection and sophisticated manipulation. David found himself measuring twice and cutting wrong, misplacing tools, forgetting appointments with clients who'd relied on him for years. "You seem distracted lately, Mrs. Patterson observed gently as David attempted for the third time to align her kitchen cabinet doors properly. The elderly widow had been watching him struggle with a repair that should have taken 30 minutes, her kind eyes taking in his shaking hands and the dark circles that made him look older than his 52 years. "Just some personal stuff going on," David replied, setting down his drill and running a hand through hair that he'd forgotten to comb that morning. Around them, Mrs. Patterson's kitchen showed signs of the careful attention Alex had helped him bring to his work, the extra time spent on finishing details, the small improvements that went beyond what clients paid for the pride and craftsmanship that had made Morrison Carpentry a neighborhood institution. That nice woman who was helping Emma with college applications, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize relationship trouble without needing details. "We haven't seen her around lately." David felt his chest tighten with the familiar combination of loss and anger that Alex's name provoked. "She's not in our lives anymore." He said the words feeling inadequate to describe the scope of betrayal and emotional devastation that had followed their discovery of her true identity. By the 4th week, David's reputation for reliability was beginning to suffer. He showed up late to job sites, forgot to return phone calls, and delivered work that met technical requirements without the craftsmanship that had distinguished his business. Word traveled quickly in Aurora's tight-knit community, and the referrals that had sustained Morrison Carpentry for 20 years began drying up. The financial impact was swift and devastating. Without the anonymous support that had been stabilizing their situation for months, the Morrison family found themselves sliding backward into the kind of economic crisis that had defined their lives before Alex's arrival. Bills that had been mysteriously manageable suddenly became overwhelming. Emma's medication costs, which Aurora Medical Foundation had been covering through their assistance program, resumed depleting David's resources at a rate that made other expenses impossible. "Dad, the college counselor, says I need to register for AP exams by next week," Emma announced one evening, holding a form that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the accessibility it represented. "It's $300 total, but she says it's essential for competitive college applications." David stared at the registration form, calculating quickly in his head. $300 for exams, $800 for Emma's medication, $2,000 to catch up on the mortgage payment they'd missed while his work performance declined. The mathematics of poverty were ruthless and precise, allowing no room for the kind of hope that had sustained them during Alex's presence in their lives. We'll figure it out, he said automatically, though they both knew that figuring it out now meant choosing between Emma's academic future and her immediate medical needs. The truck that had been mysteriously repaired through Alex's insurance settlement began showing signs of its age and accumulated damage. The transmission that had been professionally rebuilt started slipping during David's commute to job sites, forcing him to plan routes that avoided hills and pray that mechanical failures wouldn't strand him in situations that would cost him clients he couldn't afford to lose. Emma watched her father's deterioration with the helpless clarity of someone who'd already learned that love couldn't protect people from circumstances beyond their control. She'd lost her mother to cancer, discovered that her surrogate mother was living an elaborate lie, and now she was watching her father fall apart under the weight of problems they'd temporarily escaped but never actually solved. Dad, maybe we should call her, Emma suggested one evening, as they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by bills they couldn't pay and college applications they couldn't afford to complete. Maybe we should let her explain, or at least ask her to restore the medical foundation funding while we figure out what happens between us personally. David looked up from the stack of overdue notices he'd been organizing with the grim efficiency of someone planning financial triage. Emma, we can't ask her for money. That would just prove that she was right to think we needed her charity instead of her honesty. But I need that medication, Emma replied, her voice carrying the practical desperation of someone whose life literally depended on pills they couldn't afford. And you need to know that I can get into college, even if it means accepting help from someone who lied to us. The conversation that followed was devastating in its clarity. They could maintain their pride and watch Emma's health deteriorate while her academic dreams crumbled, or they could swallow their dignity and contact the woman who'd systematically deceived them for over a year. Both choices felt like losing different paths to the same destination of defeat and dependence. David found himself drinking more than he had since the worst days after Sarah's death. Not enough to be dysfunctional, but enough to blur the edges of his constant anger and disappointment. Enough to make sleep possible despite the voices in his head that alternated between missing Alex desperately and hating her completely. The veterans support group he'd attended sporadically for years became his only outlet for emotions too complicated for Emma to shoulder. Sitting in a circle of metal folding chairs in the community center basement, David found himself trying to explain betrayal to men who understood combat trauma, but struggled with the particular pain of discovering that love could be weapons-grade deception. She made us feel grateful for help we never asked for. David told the group one Thursday evening, his voice hoarse from another sleepless night. She let us worry about money while sitting on resources that could have solved every problem we've ever had. What kind of person does that to people they claim to love? The question hung in the air among men who'd learned that people could lie about everything that mattered, that trust was a luxury that had to be earned repeatedly, that love was never safe from the kind of betrayal that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. Maybe, suggested Tony, the homeless veteran, who still accepted David's Friday lunch money despite knowing it was desperately needed elsewhere. She was scared. Maybe she loved you enough to want to help, but not enough to trust you with the truth. David nodded, recognizing the brutal accuracy of the assessment. Alexandra Sterling had loved them enough to improve their lives systematically and secretly, but not enough to risk their rejection by being honest about her identity and resources. That distinction between love that helped and love that trusted felt like the difference between charity and partnership, between being someone's project and being someone's equal. David Morrison had thought he was building a partnership with Alex Miller. Discovering that he had actually been Alexandra Sterling's charity case felt like losing everything twice. First, the woman he'd loved, then his own sense of dignity and worth. Alexandra Sterling stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching Denver's morning rush hour flow 30 stories below like blood through arteries, and felt more disconnected from human existence than she had since the accident that had claimed Marcus and Tyler. The view that had once made her feel powerful and accomplished now felt like evidence of her fundamental isolation from the world where real people lived real lives with real consequences. It had been a month since David and Emma had walked out of her corporate conference room, taking with them the only authentic happiness she'd experienced since losing her family. 31 days of returning to a life that felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit, surrounded by luxury, that emphasized emptiness rather than comfort. The penthouse that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a museum dedicated to someone else's life. The master bedroom where she'd once shared space with Marcus remained untouched, a shrine to a marriage that had died in a plane crash 18 months ago. But now the guest room where she'd been sleeping also felt contaminated by memories not of the dead, but of the living people she'd driven away through her own cowardice and elaborate deception. Alex's daily routine had contracted to the essential minimums of existence. Coffee she couldn't taste, business meetings conducted on autopilot meals. She forgot to eat while staring at her phone and composing text messages to David and Emma that she deleted before sending. The housekeeper who'd been preparing meals for 3 people had returned to cooking for 1, though Alex rarely managed more than a few bites before pushing food around her plate in patterns that reminded her of Emma's childhood habit during medical appointments. Ms. Sterling, the board is requesting your input on the quarterly development projections. Her assistant announced through the intercom system that connected her to an office she'd rarely visited during her year as Alex Miller, but which now demanded her constant attention. Tell them to proceed with whatever recommendations the committee developed. Alex replied, her voice carrying the hollow professionalism of someone going through motions without investment in outcomes. Sterling Properties had been running itself efficiently during her absence. There was no reason to believe her input was necessary now. The business that had once been her pride and Marcus's legacy now felt like an obligation. She couldn't escape a machine that generated money she didn't want to spend on a life she didn't want to live. The board meetings she attended with increasing reluctance were filled with discussions of profit margins and development strategies that seemed abstract and meaningless compared to the immediate reality of a teenage girl who needed cardiac medication and a father who was working himself to exhaustion, trying to provide opportunities his daughter deserved. Dr. Williams, her grief therapist, had been trying to help Alex process the loss of David and Emma with the same strategies they'd used to address her survival guilt after the plane crash. But this was different, more complicated, because this loss was entirely her own fault. You're grieving for people who are still alive, Dr. Williams observed during one of their sessions, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to help without judging. That's a different kind of pain than losing Marcus and Tyler. This is grief combined with regret, with the knowledge that different choices might have led to different outcomes. I know exactly where they are and what they're doing, Alex replied, staring out the therapist's window at downtown Denver's business district. I could drive to their house in 20 minutes, see them at the community center, watch Emma at her debate practice. But I can't approach them because I destroyed their trust so completely that my presence in their lives would only cause more pain. The surveillance report she'd commissioned and then immediately canceled haunted her more than the absence of information might have. She'd learned that David's business was struggling, that Emma was having to choose between AP exams and medication costs, that they were sliding back into the financial crisis that her anonymous support had been addressing. She could solve their problems with a phone call, but doing so would only prove that their relationship had been fundamentally transactional rather than authentic. Alex found herself driving through Aurora at odd hours, not to see David and Emma, but to remember what it had felt like to belong somewhere, to be needed for something more than her ability to write checks or approve development projects. The community center where she'd volunteered as Alex Miller stood empty during evening hours, its windows dark and its parking lot hosting only security lights, and memories of the woman she'd been when she'd believed genuine connection was still possible. The modest apartment she'd rented as Alex Miller remained exactly as she'd left it, frozen in time like a crime scene. The simple furniture she'd bought at discount stores, the plants she'd actually remembered to water the refrigerator, still containing condiments she'd purchased to cook meals in David's kitchen, all of it evidence of the life she'd built and then destroyed through her own inability to trust love enough to risk complete honesty. I keep waiting for them to call, Alex admitted to Dr. Williams during another session. Waiting for David to forgive me, or for Emma to need something I can provide, or for some emergency that would give me an excuse to re-enter their lives without having to address the fundamental dishonesty that poisoned everything between us. What would you say if they did call? Dr. Williams asked. I don't know, Alex replied honestly. How do you apologize for systematically lying to people for over a year? How do you explain that your feelings were genuine, even though your identity was completely fabricated? How do you prove that you love them for who they were, rather than as substitutes for the family you lost? The questions had no satisfactory answers, which was why Alex found herself paralyzed between approaching them and leaving them alone. Contact would force them to relive their betrayal, but absence meant watching from a distance as they struggled with problems she could solve effortlessly. Her assistant brought lunch. She didn't eat mail, she couldn't concentrate on reading, and updates about charity requests that felt simultaneously urgent and meaningless. Every philanthropic opportunity reminded her that she could help strangers more easily than she could repair the damage she'd done to the people she loved most. The penthouse settled into evening quiet that felt like punishment rather than peace. 30 floors below, Aurora's lights twinkled like stars in a constellation. She'd been exiled from each pinprick of illumination, representing families who were probably honest with each other, couples who shared their real names and actual circumstances, parents and children who built relationships on foundations of truth rather than elaborate deception. Alex pressed her palms against the cool glass and wondered if there was any path back from the kind of betrayal that poisoned every memory, every moment of happiness, every declaration of love they'd shared. She'd survived losing Marcus and Tyler because grief was clean, uncomplicated by choice or regret. But losing David and Emma felt like dying by degrees, knowing that different decisions could have led to different outcomes, that courage might have prevented devastation. Somewhere in Aurora, the Morrison family was probably sitting down to dinner, maybe talking about Emma's college applications or David's latest carpentry project, possibly even discussing whether they missed the woman who'd been Alex Miller or hated the woman who'd turned out to be Alexandra Sterling. And Alex stood alone in her tower, surrounded by everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered, wondering if redemption was possible for someone who'd loved genuinely, but lived dishonestly, who'd given everything except the truth that might have made everything else meaningful. The city lights blurred through tears she didn't remember starting to cry, and Alexandra Sterling allowed herself to grieve for Alex Miller, the woman she'd been when she'd believed that love could survive anything, even the careful lies meant to protect it. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks after the confrontation that had destroyed everything David Morrison thought he knew about love and trust. The sharp ring of his phone cut through the restless sleep that had become his nightly ritual, jolting him awake with the particular terror that middle-of-the-night calls were brought to single parents of medically fragile children. "Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Patel at Aurora General. Emma was brought in by ambulance 20 minutes ago. She's stable, but we need you here immediately." David's hands shook as he threw on clothes, his mind racing through the possibilities while his body moved on autopilot. Emma had been having more frequent episodes lately. Chest pain, irregular heartbeat, the breathless exhaustion that came when her medication wasn't managing her condition effectively. They'd been rationing her pills for 3 weeks, stretching a 30-day supply across 45 days because David's reduced income couldn't cover the $800 monthly cost. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of early morning emptiness and fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and unforgiving. David found Emma in the cardiac unit, her face pale against the hospital pillow, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with the mechanical rhythm of life being sustained rather than lived. "Dad," she whispered when she saw him, her voice carrying the careful weakness of someone trying not to alarm the person who needed reassurance most. "I'm okay. Just had some trouble breathing during the night." Dr. Patel appeared beside them with the grave expression David had learned to dread over the past 4 years of cardiac episodes and medical crises. Mr. Morrison, Emma's heart rhythm became dangerously irregular around midnight. Her roommate at the debate team sleepover called 911 when she couldn't wake her up. The words hit David like physical blows. Couldn't wake her up. Dangerously irregular. The kind of phrases that meant his daughter had come close to dying while he slept peacefully at home, unaware that rationing her medication was creating exactly the crisis they'd been trying to prevent. "The immediate problem is manageable with IV medication." Dr. Patel continued, his voice carrying the careful neutrality doctors use when delivering news that contained both relief and devastating implications. "But Emma needs surgery within the next 2 weeks. The valve repair we've been postponing is no longer optional. It's the difference between managing her condition and losing her." David felt the floor shift beneath him as the scope of their crisis became clear. Surgery meant hospitalization, recovery time, specialist care, and costs that would bankrupt them, even if he worked every day for the next 10 years. Surgery meant Emma would live, but it also meant financial devastation, that would destroy any possibility of college career or the future she'd been working toward since childhood. "What are we looking at cost-wise?" David asked, though he already knew the answer would be impossible. "The surgery itself is approximately $150,000, Dr. Patel replied. "Recovery and follow-up care will add another $50,000 over the next year. I know that's overwhelming, but we have social workers who can help you navigate insurance appeals and assistance programs." David stared at the numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the accessibility they represented. His insurance had already denied coverage for the surgery twice, determining it was investigational, despite Dr. Patel's insistence that it was medically necessary. Even with assistance programs, their portion would exceed his annual income. "How long do we have to arrange financing?" David asked, though the question felt like planning his own execution. "2 weeks maximum," Dr. Patel said. "After that, we're looking at emergency surgery under much more dangerous circumstances." The next 3 hours passed in a haze of paperwork, insurance calls, and the particular helplessness that came with watching your child's life reduced to financial calculations. David sat beside Emma's bed, holding her hand while she slept under sedation, and tried to figure out how to choose between his daughter's life and their family's future. The social worker who appeared at dawn was kind but realistic. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed your financial situation and insurance coverage. Even with every assistance program we can access, you're looking at $75,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. Do you have assets you could liquidate, family members who might help, any resources we haven't explored?" David looked around the hospital room where his daughter might die because he couldn't afford to save her, and felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with cardiac anatomy. This was the moment he'd been dreading since Sarah's death, the point where love wasn't enough, where determination and hard work couldn't bridge the gap between need and possibility. "No," he said quietly. "I don't have anything left to sell, and there's no one who can help with that kind of money." Except his trader mind whispered there was someone. Someone who'd been systematically solving their financial problems for over a year, someone with resources so vast that $75,000 represented pocket change rather than life-altering debt. But asking Alexandra Sterling for help would mean admitting that their entire relationship had been exactly what he'd accused her of: charity rather than partnership, pity rather than love. It would mean swallowing his pride and accepting that Emma's life was more important than his wounded dignity. As Emma slept in the mechanical quietude of the cardiac unit, David Morrison faced the hardest choice of his life: maintain his principles and watch his daughter die, or sacrifice his pride and contact the woman who'd lied to them, but who had the power to save Emma's life with a phone call. The choice, when he finally made it, felt like surrendering everything he'd believed about independence, dignity, and the value of honest love. But Emma's life was worth more than his pride. It was worth more than his anger, his sense of betrayal, or his desperate need to prove that the Morrison family could survive without Alexandra Sterling's secret generosity. David pulled out his phone and stared at Alex's number for a long time before finally typing a message he never thought he'd send: "Emma needs surgery. Can we talk?" Alexandra Sterling was reviewing quarterly reports at 3:15 a.m. when her phone buzzed with the message that made her heart stop completely. She'd been hoping for contact from David or Emma for 6 weeks, imagining dozens of scenarios where they might reach out, but never the one that had actually materialized: a medical emergency that reduced their complex emotional situation to the stark mathematics of life and death. She was in her car within minutes, driving through Denver's empty streets toward Aurora General with the focused intensity of someone who'd received a second chance at redemption and refused to waste it on careful planning or emotional preparation. The security guard at the hospital entrance recognized the kind of urgent arrival that meant family crisis and waved her through without the usual visitor protocols. David was sitting in the cardiac unit waiting room, his head in his hands, when Alex found him. He looked older than his 52 years, worn down by weeks of struggling alone with problems that had been secretly managed during their relationship. The sight of him, exhausted, desperate, reduced to contacting the woman who'd betrayed his trust because his daughter's life hung in the balance, made Alex's chest tighten with grief and guilt in equal measure. "How is she?" Alex asked, settling into the chair beside him with the careful distance of someone who'd forfeited the right to offer comfort but couldn't bear to stay away. "She needs surgery within 2 weeks, David replied without looking up. Valve repair that costs more than I'll earn in the next 5 years. Insurance won't cover it, assistance programs aren't enough, and I'm out of options. The stark facts hung between them like an indictment of every choice Alex had made since meeting them. She could solve this problem with a phone call, could ensure Emma received the best cardiac care available anywhere in the world, could remove financial stress as a factor in medical decisions that shouldn't involve money at all. I can cover the surgery costs, Alex said simply, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she was offering. I know you can, David replied, finally meeting her eyes. That's why I called. But I need to understand something first. If you pay for Emma's surgery, is it because you love her and want to save her life, or because helping us makes you feel better about having more money than you can spend? The question was brutal in its directness, cutting through any possibility of comfortable lies or face-saving explanations. David was asking her to examine her own motivations with the same analytical precision Emma had used to uncover her deception. Both, Alex answered honestly, the truth feeling like surgery without anesthesia. I love Emma like she was my own daughter, and losing both of you has been devastating. But I also know that I have resources that make your crisis solvable in ways that most people's aren't. And using that privilege to help feels like the only meaningful thing I can do with money I never earned. David nodded slowly, processing her honesty. If I accept your help, what happens between us? Do we pretend the last 6 weeks didn't happen? Do we go back to being a family built on lies? Or do we figure out how to be honest with each other? I don't know, Alex admitted. All I know is that Emma deserves every chance to live the life she's been working toward, and I have the ability to make that possible. Everything else, our relationship, your trust, whether we can ever be a family again, that's secondary to making sure she survives. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared during their relationship, marked by complete honesty about motivations, expectations, and the fundamental inequalities that Alex's wealth created in any relationship she attempted. They discussed practicalities, how to handle the medical expenses without creating tax implications for David, how to ensure Emma's future medical needs would be covered, how to navigate the emotional complexity of accepting help from someone who'd systematically deceived them. I want to establish a medical trust fund for Emma, Alex said as they worked through logistics, managed by independent trustees with enough funding to cover any cardiac care she might need for the rest of her life. Not as charity, but as an investment in someone whose potential contribution to medicine could benefit thousands of other patients. That's a lot of money, David observed. It's a fraction of what I inherited from Marcus and Tyler's life insurance, Alex replied. Money that came from their deaths that I've never been able to spend on anything that felt worthy of their memory. Helping Emma become the doctor she's meant to be, that feels like honoring their lives in a way that matters. What Alex didn't mention, what she kept carefully private, was the other decision she'd made during the sleepless hours between receiving David's message and arriving at the hospital. The decision that felt like the only authentic response to everything she'd learned about love loss and the responsibility that came with unearned privilege. She would pay for Emma's surgery, establish the medical trust fund, and then step back completely from their lives. No more anonymous support, no more careful manipulation of their circumstances, no more attempts to maintain relationships built on deception. This time her help would come with complete transparency and no expectation of gratitude or forgiveness. Emma would live, David would have the resources to provide for his daughter's future, and Alex would return to her penthouse to figure out how to build a life worth living without the family she'd found and lost through her own cowardice. It was the last gift she could give them, the freedom to choose their own relationship with her or to choose no relationship at all without financial pressure influencing their decision. Emma Morrison was smarter than both adults had given her credit for, and she'd been listening to their conversation from her hospital bed with the focused attention of someone whose life hung in the balance of decisions being made on her behalf. When the surgery was scheduled and funding mysteriously appeared through Aurora Medical Foundation's Emergency Intervention Program, Emma knew exactly what had happened and why. Recovery gave her 2 weeks of forced stillness to think through everything she'd learned about love, honesty, and the difference between help that came with strings attached and help that came with no expectations at all. The surgery had been successful, though Patel pronounced her heart better than it's been in years, but the emotional recovery would take longer. Dad, Emma said one afternoon as David sat beside her hospital bed looking more relaxed than she'd seen him since before Alex's identity revelation. We need to talk about what Alex did. David glanced up from the crossword puzzle he'd been working on his first attempt at leisure activity in weeks. What do you mean? I mean that she paid for my surgery knowing we might never speak to her again, Emma said with a directness that had made her an effective debater and would someday make her a formidable physician. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make it conditional on us taking her back, didn't even stick around to be thanked. She just solved our problem and disappeared. David set down his pencil, recognizing the tone Emma used when she'd reached conclusions he might not want to hear. What's your point? My point is that someone who was just using us as a charity project wouldn't have helped us after we rejected her. Emma continued her analytical mind, working through the emotional mathematics of motivation and sacrifice. Someone who was playing house with poor people for entertainment wouldn't have paid for surgery she'd never get credit for. The observation hung between them like evidence in a case neither of them was sure they wanted to prosecute. Emma had been thinking about Alex's motivations for 2 weeks, examining them with the same systematic approach she'd used to uncover the deception in the first place. She lied to us for over a year, David reminded her, though his voice carried less conviction than it had 6 weeks earlier. Yes, she did, Emma agreed. But Dad, think about why she lied. She was a billionaire who'd lost her husband and son trying to figure out how to live again. She met us during a crisis, helped us, and then got scared that if we knew who she really was, we'd either reject her or love her for the wrong reasons. David considered this, recognizing the uncomfortable logic in his daughter's analysis. You think she was protecting herself more than deceiving us? I think she was protecting all of us. Emma said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned early that love was complicated and survival required accepting imperfect solutions. Think about it, if she'd told you on our second date that she was worth $500 million, would you have believed her feelings were genuine? Would you have been able to build a relationship with her, or would you have been too intimidated, too suspicious, too worried about what she wanted from us? The questions were uncomfortable because they demanded honesty about David's own limitations, his pride, his ability to accept love from someone whose circumstances were so different from his own. Would he have been able to love Alexandra Sterling, or had Alex Miller been necessary for their relationship to develop naturally? And Emma continued pressing her advantage with the persistence of someone arguing for something that mattered. She never made us feel like charity cases when she was helping us. She made it seem natural, earned, like we deserved the opportunities that started appearing. Even her lies were designed to protect our dignity. Over the following days, Emma's perspective began shifting David's understanding of their situation. He found himself remembering moments from their relationship that took on different meanings when viewed through the lens of protection rather than deception. Alex's careful way of introducing help that never felt like charity. Her genuine interest in Emma's academic achievements and future plans. The way she'd integrated into their family not as someone bestowing benefits, but as someone receiving the gift of belonging. She made our house feel like a home again, David admitted one evening as they prepared for Emma's discharge from the hospital. She brought back laughter, hope, the feeling that our future might hold good things instead of just more survival. And she did all that while carrying grief we can't even imagine, Emma added. Dad, she lost her husband and son in a plane crash. She was supposed to be on that plane. Can you imagine the survivor guilt, the loneliness, the weight of having unlimited resources, but nothing that actually mattered to spend them on? The recognition process was gradual but inexorable. Alex's deception, while still painful, began to feel less like manipulation and more like self-protection by someone who'd been devastated by loss and was terrified of risking love again. Her anonymous support, rather than evidence of seeing them as charity cases, began to seem like the actions of someone who loved them enough to help, but was too scared to trust them with complete honesty. What do you want to do? David asked finally, though he could see in Emma's face that she'd already reached her own conclusions. I want to talk to her, Emma said simply. I want to understand what she was thinking, what she was feeling, whether the woman we fell in love with was real, even if her name and circumstances were different. David nodded, recognizing that his remarkable daughter had once again proven wiser than her father about matters of love, forgiveness, and the complexity of human motivation. It was time to find out whether Alex Miller had been genuine emotion, wearing Alexandra Sterling's resources, or whether their entire relationship had been an elaborate performance by someone with unlimited capacity for deception. The only way to know for certain was to ask and then decide whether they trusted her enough to believe her answer. The Aurora Community Center felt different at 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening, its normally bustling hallways quiet except for the distant sound of a basketball bouncing in the gym and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that had witnessed countless life-changing conversations in these worn but welcoming spaces. Emma had chosen this location deliberately neutral ground, where Alex Miller had been real, where the work she'd done helping other families had been genuine, regardless of her hidden identity. Alexandra Sterling arrived exactly on time, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that made her look more like the Alex Miller they remembered than the corporate executive they'd confronted 6 weeks ago. She carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned not to expect forgiveness, but hoped for understanding, her hands empty of the defensive props folders, phones, business cards that might suggest this was anything other than a conversation between people who'd shared love and lost it to deception. David and Emma sat at a small table in the conference room where they'd held their first official meeting 8 months ago when insurance paperwork had seemed like their biggest challenge, and Alex Miller had been nothing more than a competent social worker with kind eyes and inexplicable knowledge of healthcare bureaucracy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Alex said, settling into the chair across from them, with the careful distance of someone who'd forfeited the right to casual intimacy but couldn't bear to remain completely separate. "And thank you for letting me help with Emma's surgery. How are you feeling?" "Physically, I'm great," Emma replied unconsciously, placing a hand over her chest where surgical scars were healing beneath her shirt. "Dr. Patel says my heart function is better than it's been in years. Emotionally, Viono, that's more complicated." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, encompassing weeks of confusion, anger, grief, and the gradual recognition that love could be genuine even when circumstances were manipulated, that deception could coexist with authentic care in ways that defied simple moral categories. "I owe you both an explanation." Alex continued, her voice carrying the careful control of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation countless times while hoping it would never be necessary. "Not excuses, not justifications, but the truth about what I was thinking and feeling when I made the choices that hurt you both so deeply." David leaned back in his chair, his carpenter's hands folded on the table between them. "We're listening. When Marcus and Tyler died, I wanted to disappear." Alex began, her voice steady despite the tears that had started gathering in her eyes. "Not kill myself exactly, but stop being Alexandra Sterling. Stop living a life that reminded me every day of everything I'd lost. Working here as Alex Miller was supposed to be temporary, a way to do something meaningful while I figured out how to keep existing." She paused, looking around the conference room, where she'd spent countless hours helping families navigate systems she'd never had to personally struggle with, but had learned to understand through other people's desperation. "Meeting you and Emma during that storm wasn't planned, but falling in love with both of you was the first genuine emotion I'd felt since the accident. You made me remember what it felt like to be needed for something besides my ability to write checks or approve development projects. But you never trusted us enough to be honest about who you were." David observed, his voice carrying hurt rather than anger now. "I was terrified," Alex admitted. "Terrified that if you knew I was worth $500 million, you'd wonder if my feelings were genuine or if I was just playing house with people whose struggles made me feel better about my own privilege. Terrified that Emma would feel awkward about our friendship, that you'd question every gesture of affection, that our relationship would become about what I could provide rather than who we were together." Emma studied Alex's face with the analytical intensity she brought to complex problems. "So you decided to lie to protect us from making our own decisions about whether we could handle the truth." The question was direct, uncomfortable, and completely accurate. Alex felt her face flush with recognition of the fundamental arrogance that had motivated her deception, the assumption that she knew better than David and Emma how they would react to honesty, the decision to manage their emotions, rather than trust them with complete information. "Yes," Lex said simply. "I decided that lie was kinder than truth, and I was wrong about that. I robbed both of you of the chance to choose whether you could love Alexandra Sterling because I was too scared to risk finding out the answer. What about all the anonymous help? David asked. The insurance settlements, the medical foundation, the scholarship programs that seemed designed specifically for Emma's needs. I saw how much you were struggling, and I had resources that could solve your problems without changing the dynamic between us, Alex explained. I told myself I was protecting your dignity by helping secretly, but really I was protecting myself from having to admit that our relationship was fundamentally unequal in ways that money made impossible to ignore. The conversation continued for another hour, covering every aspect of their relationship that had been contaminated by deception. Alex answered their questions with complete honesty, admitting to the scope of her secret support, the elaborate logistics required to maintain her double identity, and the growing guilt that had made every moment of happiness feel stolen rather than earned. The hardest part, Alex said finally, was that my feelings for both of you were completely genuine, but they were based on relationships I'd built through systematic dishonesty. I loved David Morrison, the man who showed me that strength could be gentle and that family was built through daily choices rather than grand gestures. I loved Emma Morrison, who reminded me that intelligence and ambition could coexist with compassion and that dreams were worth protecting even when circumstances made them seem impossible. But you never gave us the chance to love Alexandra Sterling, Itamar, Emma observed. No, Alex agreed. I never trusted either of you enough to risk being rejected for who I actually was. The silence that followed Alex's complete confession was not uncomfortable, but contemplative, the quiet of people processing information that would reshape everything they thought they understood about love, trust, and the possibility of building authentic relationships across fundamental differences in circumstance and experience. Emma was the first to speak, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd reached conclusions through systematic analysis rather than emotional impulse. Alex, I need to tell you something. The woman I fell in love with as a second mother, her kindness, her interest in my dreams, her ability to make our house feel like a home again, that woman was real. She existed independently of your name or your bank account or your corporate identity. Alex felt tears she'd been carefully controlling finally spill over as Emma continued. I've been angry about the lying, and I've been hurt by the deception, but I've never doubted that your love for us was genuine. You don't fake the kind of attention you paid to my homework, or the way you listened when I talked about wanting to be a doctor, or the way you made Dad laugh for the first time since Mom died. David found himself nodding, recognizing the truth in his daughter's analysis. The morning you made pancakes shaped like hearts because Emma was nervous about her college interview, that wasn't Alexandra Sterling performing charity. That was Alex Miller being a mother to a girl who needed one. But David, Alex interrupted, I was still lying to you every single day. Every conversation we had about financial stress, every time you worried about providing for Emma's future, every moment you felt grateful for help you didn't know was coming from me, those were based on deception. Yes, they were, David agreed. And that hurt us and broke our trust and made us question everything we thought we knew about our relationship. But Alex, I've had 6 weeks to think about this, and I keep coming back to one question. If you'd told me on our second date that you were a billionaire, would we be sitting here now? The question forced Alex to confront her own assumptions about David's character and capacity for handling complex truths. I don't know, she admitted. I do. Abu, David said firmly, I would have run, not because I'm a gold digger or because I would have questioned your motives, but because I wouldn't have believed that someone like you could genuinely love someone like me. My pride, my insecurity, my complete lack of experience with your world, all of that would have made a real relationship impossible. Emma leaned forward, her analytical mind working through the implications. So the lying was wrong, but it might have been necessary for the relationship to develop naturally. I think, David said slowly, that Alex created Alex Miller because that was the only way she could risk loving again and the only way we could have fallen in love with her without the money getting in the way of everything else. The recognition felt revolutionary that Alex's deception, while hurtful and wrong, might have been the imperfect solution to an impossible problem. How do you build authentic relationships when fundamental inequalities make honesty feel like a barrier to genuine connection? What I know for certain, David continued, is that the woman who helped Emma with her college essays, who taught her to parallel park, who made our family feel complete again, that woman exists. And I love her. Not her money, not her ability to solve our problems, but her laugh and her intelligence and her capacity to see Emma's potential and believe in it completely. I love her too, Emma added. But I need to know that going forward, we're building something based on complete honesty. No more secret foundations, no more anonymous help, no more managing our lives from behind the scenes. If we're going to be a family, we need to be partners who trust each other with difficult truths. Alex felt hope flicker in her chest for the first time since the confrontation 6 weeks ago. What would that look like practically? How do we navigate the reality that I have resources that could solve every problem you'll ever face while maintaining the equality that real partnerships require? The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared during their original relationship, marked by complete transparency about money expectations and the complex negotiations required when love existed across fundamental differences in financial capacity. They discussed practical matters, how Alex could contribute to household expenses without making David feel like a kept man, how to handle Emma's college costs and future medical needs, how to ensure that Alex's wealth enhanced their lives without overwhelming their autonomy. I want to contribute to our life together, Alex said, but as Alex Miller, who happens to have significant resources, not as Alexandra Sterling, bestowing benefits on worthy recipients. And we want to accept your help, David replied, but as partners making decisions together, not as beneficiaries of your generosity. They were building something new, not the relationship based on deception that had existed before, and not the corporate charity that Alexandra Sterling might have offered, but a family constructed on the foundation of complete honesty about both love and money, both need and capacity. There's one more thing, Alex said as their conversation neared its end. I want you both to know that helping with Emma's surgery wasn't about earning forgiveness or buying my way back into your lives. I did it because I love her, and because people who love each other help when help is needed, regardless of what it means for their own relationship. We know, Emma said simply, and that's why we're here talking instead of just accepting your money and never speaking to you again. Because the surgery proved that your feelings for us aren't conditional on getting something in return. As they prepared to leave the community center, David reached across the table and took Alex's hand, the first physical contact between them since the confrontation. Alex, we're not going back to the way things were before. We can't because too much has changed. But maybe we can build something better, something based on truth instead of protection, partnership instead of charity, trust instead of fear. I'd like that, Alex replied, her voice thick with emotion and possibility. I'd like that very much. They walked out of the community center together, three people who'd learned that love could survive deception, but flourished in honesty. That family could be rebuilt on stronger foundations when everyone was brave enough to risk complete truth. The healing would take time, trust would have to be earned again through consistent honesty, and they would need to navigate the complexities of building authentic relationships across fundamental differences in circumstance and privilege. But for the first time in 6 weeks, they were walking in the same direction toward a future that might include all of them, not as Alex Miller's charity project, not as Alexandra Sterling's entertainment, but as a family chosen and maintained through the daily decision to love each other honestly, completely, and without reservation. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the house on Maple Street, the same modest 2-story home where David Morrison had raised his daughter alone, but now expanded with a careful addition that had been Alex's first official contribution to their shared life. The new wing included a proper home office where Emma could study for her pre-med courses at University of Colorado, and a workshop where David could refinish furniture during evenings when his expanding business didn't demand his attention. Emma stood at the kitchen island, still in her scrubs from her hospital volunteer shift, reviewing flashcards for her organic chemistry exam, while Alex packed lunch for David's latest project, renovating the community center's meeting rooms. Through Morrison Sterling Construction, the company they'd established 6 months after their reconciliation. Dad's going to be late if he doesn't stop obsessing over those cabinet measurements, Emma observed, glancing toward the workshop where the sound of careful sanding had been ongoing since dawn. Your father doesn't do anything halfway, Alex replied, adding an extra apple to the lunch bag because David always forgot to eat when he was focused on detailed work. Besides, Mrs. Patterson deserves perfection after waiting 3 months for us to fit her kitchen renovation into the schedule. The easy domesticity of their morning routine had been earned through months of careful navigation, honest conversations about money and expectations, and the daily choice to build trust through transparency rather than protection. Alex's engagement ring, a simple band that David had insisted on paying for himself despite her protests that money wasn't the point, caught the morning light as she moved around the kitchen that had become the heart of their reconstructed family. I still can't believe you're going to be Dr. Emma Morrison Sterling in 4 years, Alex said, watching Emma organize her study materials with the methodical precision that would serve her well in medical school. Dr. Emma Morrison, Emma corrected with a grin. I'm keeping Dad's name for my professional identity, but I'll hyphenate for family stuff so you know you're officially stuck with us. The correction made Alex's heart swell with the particular joy of someone who'd been chosen rather than simply accepted, whose place in this family had been deliberately and thoughtfully constructed rather than assumed or imposed. Through the window, they could see David loading his truck with tools and the confidence of someone whose business was thriving through word-of-mouth recommendations and the reputation for honest work that had sustained Morrison Carpentry for 20 years. The addition of Alex's business expertise and access to commercial projects had allowed him to hire 3 full-time employees, all local workers who shared his commitment to craftsmanship and fair dealing. As David appeared in the kitchen doorway, work clothes on and coffee mug in hand, Alex felt a familiar rush of gratitude for second chances and the courage required to risk love again after devastating loss. Their relationship had been built on deception, destroyed by revelation, and rebuilt through the harder work of complete honesty, proof that authentic love could survive almost anything if both people were willing to choose truth over comfort. Morning, beautiful, David said, kissing Alex's cheek before ruffling Emma's hair in the gesture that had become their family's signature affection. Ready for another day of changing the world, one perfect cabinet joint at a time. The teasing reference to his perfectionist tendencies made both women laugh, and Alex marveled at how ordinary happiness could feel revolutionary when you'd thought you'd lost the capacity for joy forever. Marcus and Tyler would always be part of her story, their memory woven into the fabric of who she'd become, but David and Emma had taught her that love wasn't finite, that opening your heart again didn't diminish what you'd had before, but expanded your capacity for connection and meaning. Actually, Emma announced, setting down her flashcards with a dramatic flair that had made her formidable on the debate team. I have news that's going to change all of our days. David and Alex exchanged glances, recognizing the tone Emma used when she'd made decisions that would affect the entire family. I got the call yesterday, but I wanted to tell you both together. Emma continued, her face glowing with excitement and pride. I've been accepted to the Johns Hopkins Early Admission Program for pre-med, full academic scholarship plus a stipend for living expenses. The kitchen erupted in celebration, David's proud shouting, Alex's tears of joy, Emma's laughter as she was swept into a 3-person hug that captured everything their family had become. This was the future they had been working toward since that first night when Alex had helped during Emma's medical crisis, but it felt miraculous rather than inevitable. Johns Hopkins, David repeated, shaking his head in wonder. My daughter, the future doctor, going to one of the best medical schools in the country. Our daughter, Alex corrected gently, the possessive pronoun carrying all the love and legal adoption papers that had made their family official 6 months ago. And this is just the beginning, Doctor. Emma Morrison is going to change pediatric cardiology forever. The prediction felt like prophecy rather than hope, spoken by people who'd learned that dreams were worth protecting, that love could survive deception but flourished in honesty, and that families could be built through choice and maintained through the daily decision to show up for each other completely. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that love can survive anything, even the mistakes we make trying to protect it, hit subscribe to see more proof that second chances are always possible when we're brave enough to choose truth over comfort. Yoshimum. Share this with someone who needs to believe that authentic connection is worth the risk of complete honesty. Comment below with your own story of love that survived betrayal, trust that was rebuilt stronger than before, or families that were chosen rather than simply inherited. Your journey could inspire our next story about the extraordinary love that exists in ordinary moments. The courage required to risk everything for authentic connection, and the revolutionary power of choosing each other daily honestly and without reservation. Remember, the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing to love each other completely. Flaws and all mistakes and growth through every season of joy and challenge that life offers. Thank you for believing in second chances, for understanding that families come in all forms, and for knowing that the most powerful transformations happen not through money or status, but through the simple decision to show up authentically for the people who matter most. Final frame. The camera pulls back to show the Morrison-Sterling family working together in their expanded garden. David teaching Alex the proper technique for planting tomatoes, while Emma documents their progress for her Instagram account about pre-med life with the world's most adorable parents. The setting sun casts golden light over Aurora's modest neighborhood where three people who'd found each other through crisis had built something permanent through choice love and the revolutionary decision to be completely honest about who they were and what they needed from each other. The last shot is of their mailbox, which now reads, "The Morrison-Sterling family," in David's careful hand lettering. Not because Alexandra Sterling had bought her way into their lives, but because Alex Miller had earned her place through the harder currency of love, patience, and the courage to be known completely by people who chose to love her, not despite her flaws and mistakes, but because of her humanity, her capacity for growth, and her willingness to risk everything for the chance at authentic connection. Love had won not through perfection, but through persistence. Family had been built not through circumstances, but through choice. And three people who'd started as strangers had become proof that the most ordinary moments, kitchen conversations, garden work, the daily decision to show up for each other, were actually the most extraordinary miracles available to anyone brave enough to believe that they deserve to be loved completely, honestly, and without reservation.